Cara, não acredito que eu falei tanta coisa e o microfone, filho da mãe, tava desligado. Bom, então já sabe, né? Sejam todos muito bem-vindos e é isso aí. Vamos falando do mercado aqui. Ah, se lascar, porra. Fala aí, Rafael Mesquita, beleza, cara? Seja bem-vindo, valeu por falar sem o áudio aí. Meu, cabacei, esqueci de ligar a porra do microfone. Puta merda, viu, meu? Vamos falando do mercado financeiro então, pessoal. Esse aqui é o microcontrato do S&P 500 Futuro, que ontem lá no fechamento ajustado ficou na casa do 4.349,75. Com a abertura ontem às 19 horas ficou lá na casa do 358,25, um belo gap de alta pelo fechamento ajustado e abertura. A mínima ficou no 355, a máxima no 388, fazendo aí 33,5 pontos de amplitude, tá? Do movimento. Vamos falar do Nasdaq rapidinho também. Ih, cacete, hoje tá embaçado o bagulho aqui, meu. Vou te contar, cara, tá foda. Ontem foi ruim de operar, né? Já já a gente fala sobre isso. Então esse aqui é o microcontrato do Nasdaq Futuro, que ontem lá no fechamento ajustado ficou no 14.739,75. A abertura foi lá no 762, um pequeno gap de alta na abertura. Ele que já fez o range no 14.754,50 e na mínima e no 14.884 cravado na máxima, andando aí mais de 100 pontos. Aí a gente vai falar aqui dos mercados internacionais. Nós tivemos aqui na região do Pacífico a Austrália ficando aqui no campo positivo, 1,88 de alta. O Japão ficou no campo negativo, 0,31. A China ficou aqui no campo positivo com Xangai, 0,90. Hong Kong ficou no campo negativo com o Hang Seng 0,36, a Coreia do Sul foi para cima 0,28. Aí depois a gente vai para a Europa, ficando a Bélgica, Noruega aqui 0,96 de alta, Bélgica 0,75 também de alta. No campo negativo nós temos a Espanha 0,52, a Itália 0,23, a Suíça foi para cima 0,13. Continuando o campo negativo, nós temos o Eurostock 50 0,29 e a Alemanha 0,42 de queda, os dois, e a Inglaterra 0,05 de alta. Nós temos aí na Europa um cenário bastante misto. Deixa eu ver se eu tenho aqui... cara, que pena. Não deixei aberto o Investing. Deixa eu ver se eu... Não, vou pegar não, foda-se. Deixa pra lá. E aqui, no campo dos Estados Unidos, o Russell fechou, esses são todos à vista, tá? O Russell fechou 0,30 de queda, o S&P 0,16 de alta. E o Nasdaq fechou para baixo também 0,24 de queda, o Dow fechou para cima 0,26, tá? Viu o que está acontecendo com o Nasdaq? Ainda não, já já a gente fala sobre isso aí, cara, vamos olhar já. Já. No campo dos pares de moedas, nós temos o DX, está em alta marginal 0,03, com o dólar ganhando do euro 0,12, está zerado aqui, né, no 0 a 0 contra o iene, está perdendo para a libra esterlina 0,26, perde para o franco da Suíça 0,05, perde para o dólar do Canadá 0,08, perde para a coroa sueca 0,40. No campo dos emergentes, nós ganhamos nesse momento aqui 0,17 de alta do real perante o dólar. Pagamos aqui R$ 5,40, quase 41 centavos. Alguns dos emergentes ganham e outros perdem. No campo dos outros ativos, nós temos o ouro 0,77 de alta, o tesouro 0,13 de alta no valor do yield. Então, 1,54, quase 54% cravado o valor do yield, que é a remuneração anual do Tesouro, nota de 10 anos. O petróleo está indo para baixo forte aqui, 1,44 a 73 dólares e 75 centavos, e o S&P sobe nesse momento 0,37 a 4.366, esse é o futuro. No campo aqui dos dados econômicos, nós temos o seguinte. Já saiu aqui, né, o PIB dos Estados Unidos, veio bom, pouquinho acima do esperado, isso é legal. O índice de preços do PIB também veio um pouquinho acima do esperado, isso é legal. Já o pedidos iniciais do seguro-desemprego arrebentou, né? Veio bem acima do esperado, isso aqui não é muito bom aí, tá demonstrando que tá muita gente sendo mandada embora lá nos Estados Unidos. Já já nós teremos às 10h45 o PMI de Chicago e às 11 horas nós teremos aqui o depoimento do pica-grossa do Fed, que é o Jerome Powell, vai falar na Câmara dos Deputados lá nos Estados Unidos. Vamos ver se a gente consegue identificar ou achar algum vídeo que mostre ele falando. Porém, hoje, pessoal, a gente vai no máximo até 12h20, porque eu tenho compromisso mais tarde. Não vou poder ficar muito, tá? Então a gente vai no máximo até 12h20. Mais tarde ainda teremos discurso do John Williams, do Raphael Bostic e do Patrick Harker, esses daqui todos no período mais tarde. O John Williams fala ao mesmo tempo que o Jerome Powell. Certo? Aí sim, agora a gente vai falar do gráfico aqui. Já deixei aqui o gráfico. Vamos dar uma olhada no Nasdaq aqui que o Mesquita já falou ali. Nasdaq, tá dando uma voltada aqui, né? Ele tentou ficar acima aqui dessa região da média de 80 e tá voltando. Cara, perdeu a mínima desse cara aqui, ó. Na minha opinião, ele tende a vir buscar aqui essa região, lá no 14.400, cara. Essa é a minha opinião. Vamos falar do S&P no gráfico diário, então. Ontem, cara, ficou ruim para operar, né, cara? Ele ficou andando dentro desse range aqui, ó. Tá? Ficou péssimo para ser operado. Eu esqueci de um detalhe importante ontem na operação e vou falar agora, porque ó, depois de uma barra muito ampla no diário, no dia seguinte pode ser que aconteçam dois cenários. O primeiro, ele pode voltar em V, ou seja, ele fez uma barra ampla na queda e faz uma barra ampla na alta, certo? Esse é um cenário. O segundo cenário faz uma barra ampla, não importa se é para cima ou se é para baixo, e depois ele faz um candle bem pequenininho, né? Por exemplo, aqui, ó, nós tivemos dois candles amplos e depois fez um candle pequenininho. Tá vendo aqui, ó? Olha só, fez um candle amplo, tá? Ele foi muita volatilidade aqui, né? Tem uma volatilidade tremenda, depois fez um candle pequeno, certo? Então, eu não levei isso em consideração, acabei tomando 3 stops em live, depois ainda tomei mais um stop, cara, que depois a gente fala sobre isso. Enfim, né? Então nós temos aqui tendência de queda no gráfico diário, tendência de queda, fez uma correção, segurou em cima do 618 e agora veio para baixo, tá vindo para perder essa região aqui. Vamos ver se ele vai confirmar a perda dessa região ou não pelo gráfico diário. Hoje, olha só, ele já demonstrou uma alta volatilidade, foi lá em cima e voltou um pouquinho, tá? Vamos colocar aqui no gráfico de 60 minutos, a gente consegue ver melhor. Olha só, depois das 4 horas da manhã, olha como ele vem buscando queda aqui. Média de 9 apontando para baixo. Ontem ele ficou nesse range aqui, depois que abriu a NYSE. Olha só o range de filho de uma mãe, cara. Meu, ontem foi um péssimo dia para mim, mas estamos aqui novamente. Deixa eu colocar esse range aí dos 60 minutos. Olha só, ficou andando dentro desse range aqui, foi péssimo para atuar. Hoje já não, hoje ele já rompeu esse range e está voltando nessa região aqui. Vamos ver como que ele permanece, como é que ele vai ficar aqui. Tende a vir buscar aqui, ó, o fechamento ajustado. Se romper o fechamento ajustado, vai buscar aquele fundo lá que eu já havia falado para vocês lá embaixo. Beleza, ó, buscou a retração de 50% dessa onda de queda forte aqui, né? Ó, segurou em cima, perfeito da retração de 50%. Vou colocar aqui, esse cara aqui, ó. Tá vendo como ele segurou perfeito, ó. Ontem segurou aqui na retração de 618, hoje segurou na retração de 50%. Certo? Vendeu petróleo ontem, encerrou hoje. Mandou bem? Foi bom, Mesquita? Vendeu, né? O petróleo caiu, então mandou bem. Isso aí. Bom, então ele vem caindo aqui hoje, certo? Rompeu o LTB para baixo, está formando uma nova LTB, não, LTA aqui, né? Nós temos essa LTB, olha como ele segurou nessa LTB aqui, ó, cara. Segurou aqui essa região. E essa LTB mais inclinada, ele rompeu ela, né? Agora está formando uma linhazinha de alta aqui, pode ser um canalzinho de alta. Vamos colocar um canal, deixa eu ver, um canal. Acho que um canal manda bem. Um canalzinho aqui nos 60 minutos. Olha só, esse canalzinho de alta aqui. Ó, manda super bem esse canalzinho aqui, ó. Dá até pra para puxar um pouquinho mais assim. Olha só, esse canal dos 60 minutos parece uma bandeira de baixa, tá? Na minha opinião, é muito semelhante a uma bandeira de baixa. Não, mas o range é grande, né? Mas a bandeira é de baixa, tá? E poderia espelhar toda essa onda aqui para baixo depois do rompimento ali. Então, vou fazer isso agora. A gente pega esse cara aqui. Se ele romper aí, a partir desse rompimento, tem a chance de fazer uma vez para baixo. Esse cara, esse fibo aí. Então, fibo de uma vez para baixo. Perspectiva, aqui embaixo. 4.249. Essa é a perspectiva para esse cara se ele romper a partir dessa região aqui. Tá? Ele pode zanzar aqui, voltar para cima, pode ir para baixo, um monte de coisa que ele pode fazer. Tá? Por enquanto, no gráfico de 60 minutos é isso. No gráfico de 30 minutos a gente dá aquela olhada. Olha só, gift duplo. Esse aqui é um 9.3 também. A gente tem alvo... Opa, não, peraí, deixa eu pegar o alvo certo aqui. O alvo é deste gift aqui para cá. Ele já foi acionado, tá? Com o alvo sendo aqui embaixo. Vou falar já já o alvo para vocês. Gift do 30 minutos é um 9.3 também. Olha só, ele tem alvo aqui no 345 do 366. São aí quase 20 pontos, né? Daí 18 pontos para baixo. Certo? A entrada mais era aqui, mais aqui em cima, nesse 9.3 aqui. Tá aqui outro giftzinho. Bom, no gráfico de 30 minutos é isso. Vamos ver se ele consegue romper essa região aqui. Vou colocar uma linhazinha, uma LTBzinha aqui. Ó, essa LTB está bastante inclinada e isso me preocupa um pouco. Com essa LTB bastante inclinada, porém, né, tínhamos aqui um 9.1 aqui, um gift aqui, favor da média de 80. Por enquanto, é isso aí. No gráfico de 15, olha só, 9.3 aqui, a entrada foi aqui, ó, 9.3. Aqui, outro 9.3 com entrada aqui. Aqui foi um 9.2, entrada aqui. 9.1 com entrada aqui. Isso no 15 minutos. 15 minutos está demonstrando bastante entrada legal aí. Ontem, olha só, aqui, né? Olha como ficou feio essa região aqui, né, cara? Aqui, apesar dele ter feito barra ampla, cara, eu não consegui fazer minhas entradas legais aqui, cara. Não consegui, não teve como eu fazer minhas entradas legais. Fiz só em live, tomei 3 stops de conta real, depois acabei tomando mais um stop, onde praticamente zerei minha conta ontem. Fugi do meu plano de trading, é aquela coisa que eu sempre falo, né? Plano de trade, plano de trade, plano de trade, e eu fui na contramão e não fiz o meu plano de trading, cara, é foda. Mas nós fazemos isso mesmo, a gente vai conseguir se tornar um trader profissional, cara, é só resolver esses pequenos problemas. Ainda bem que o saldo da minha conta não era um saldo exorbitante, imagina se fosse 10 mil dólares, pelo amor de Deus, né, cara? Por isso que eu falo para você, está começando, não sente confiança, põe pouco dinheiro na conta, começa com pouco dinheiro e vai. Beleza, então foi aqui no 15 minutos, e no 15 minutos agora ele vem caindo aqui, né? Já falei das entradas, dos setups aqui, que tem aqui nesse momento. E aí a gente vai para os 5 minutos. Olha só como ele ficou zanzando essa região aqui por enquanto, né? Ó, consolidado. Região chatinha para ser operada aqui pelos 5 minutos. Olha aqui. Bem chatinha, tá rompendo agora aqui, né? E para um alvo imediato, se ele confirmar o rompimento aqui dessa região, deixa eu colocar aqui o 5 minutos aqui. Se ele confirmar essa região de queda agora, ele vai ter um alvo assim, ó. A gente pega essa onda daqui para cá e projeta ela uma vez para baixo. Se ele confirmar a ida para baixo, tá? Ele pode não confirmar, beleza? Então, aí ficaria desta forma aqui, ó. Deixa eu colocar o fibo de 5 minutos só. Esse fibo aqui é só para indicar a projeção do alvo, se caso ele vier para baixo. Então, ele teria um alvo daqui do 61 até o 51, 10 pontos de alvo, por conta desse range safadinho aqui, tá? Vamos ver o que ele vai fazer aí. Fala, Felipe Ribeiro, beleza, cara? Seja bem-vindo. Fazer day trade de madrugada é legal? Pô, pode ser. Ô, Eduardo Rodrigo, bom dia, cara. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos, como sempre. Né? Bom, então já falei desse cara aqui. Por enquanto, no overnight veio caindo. Ele estava subindo durante o overnight, né? Ó, veio subindo aqui e veio descendo aqui. Olha só, um ombro, cabeça, ombro, meio feio, mas é um ombro, cabeça, ombro, tá, galera? Olha isso aqui, ó. Um ombro, cabeça, ombro que possivelmente já deu alvo. Olha só, ombro esquerdo, cabeça aqui, uma cabeça praticamente dupla, né? Ombro direito e olha só, aqui, vou precisar puxar mais. Peraí, deixa eu subir um pouquinho aqui porque ele tá meio feinho. Tá. Olha só, então, poder nem considerar aqui esse fundo, ó, essa abertura desses dois candles aqui, olha só, ombro, cabeça, ombro, no rompimento ali já deu alvo, né? Vamos puxar aqui, do ombro, cabeça, ombro, olha só como ele já deu alvo. Ó, veio aqui, demorou um pouco para chegar, né? Saiu aqui dos 76 até os 65, 11 pontos, cara. Pô, legal, foi legal, tá? Esse tipo de coisa é o que a gente precisa identificar rápido, né? Porque como a gente é day trader, a gente precisa identificar as oportunidades rapidamente. Tá? Bom, é isso. Aqui do S&P, vamos falar do Nasdaq. Então, fala, Éder, beleza, cara? Bom dia, seja muito bem-vindo, assim como todos vocês sejam todos muito bem-vindos. Vamos falar do Nasdaq. O Nasdaq padrãozinho de ontem já tinha falado, padrão muito parecido com o S&P, segurou em cima da média da retração de 618 dessa onda toda de queda, certo? Ele rompeu, olha só que interessante, cara, anteontem ele rompeu esse fundo aqui e ontem ele tentou voltar para cima e continuou rompido aqui, hein? Olha só, continuou rompido. Hoje está tentando voltar acima da média de 80 e tende a vir perder esse fundo aqui, ó. Nós podemos colocar um alvo aqui de FIBO, olha só, já tem o alvo de FIBO, esse primeiro alvo de FIBO aqui dessa onda, e tem um alvo de FIBO maiorzão também, cara, olha só, esse alvo de FIBO maiorzão aqui, ó, é até pelo semanal, alvo aqui, ó, no 14.274. E dessa onda de queda aqui, ó, a gente pegou esse ponto aqui, o próximo ponto de alvo, que seria a projeção de 618, ainda está no 14.567, ele está no 14.787, então temos aí 200 e alguma coisa de pontos, tá? Para chegar aqui, 200 pontos para chegar aqui. Será que vai? Será que não vai? Vamos ver cenas dos próximos episódios. Aí a gente vai aqui para os 60 minutos. Ontem ele andou um pouco melhor, né? Poderia ter identificado isso aqui antes, andou um pouco melhor, olha só. Ontem, na queda aqui dos 60 minutos, só o que ele fez aqui, ó. Andou 180 pontos, cara. Andou bem bacana aqui. E eu não consegui identificar isso aqui, acabei tomando stop, toma stop aqui, toma stop ali no S&P. Até parece que eu só opero S&P, porra. Antigamente era, hoje não, né? Hoje eu opero mais. Então, aqui nessa tendência maior zona, a gente vê que ele vem caindo. Aqui embaixo, fechamento ajustado. Vou traçar uma linha aqui, ó, para pegar. Deixa eu ver. Esse topo daqui para cá. Vamos ver se esse topo vem. Se dá para fazer aqui. Não. Olha só. Pode até ser uma coincidência, cara. Pode ser uma coincidência. Mas que coincidência interessante, né? Olha o ponto de reação do preço aqui nessa região e como coincide aqui com essa LTB. Deixa eu colocar a LTB dos 60. Né? É interessante, né? Pode ser apenas uma coincidência, apesar que eu não acredito muito em coincidências, mas olha só como ele reagiu aqui nesse ponto e fez um topo aqui e um topo aqui. Tá? Então, vamos ver. Tá? Tendência de queda aqui, né? Aqui fez um fundo mais baixo, topo mais baixo. Vamos ver se ele vem para perder esse fundo aqui. Então, peraí, já falo com vocês aí. Cara, só um minuto, vamos terminar essa leitura aqui para a gente não perder Tempo, olha só uma outra LTBzinha aqui do gráfico de 30 minutos. E essa é uma LTB bastante inclinada, né? Posso puxar até aqui assim. Olha só, uma LTB bastante inclinada do gráfico de 30 minutos aqui. Tá? Olha só, 9.3 aqui, válido, entrada aqui, deixa eu ver, entrada aqui, depois aqui, agora aqui, ó, a entradinha foi aqui do 9.3 válido, tá? Esse 9.3 válido, 9.1 entrada aqui, alvo por gift, olha só, o alvo para essa entrada aí, nós temos um gift duplo ali embaixo que vale esse alvo aqui, ó. Olha só, o alvo aqui no 713, é um belo alvo, hein? 70 pontos aí para baixo. É um belo alvo. Será que ele vai lá, pessoal? Boa pergunta. E eu não sei, eu sempre respondo isso para vocês porque se eu soubesse, né, cara, pô, estaria milionário, né, meu? Já sabem disso. Sempre falo isso para vocês, tá? Então, alvo lá no 713 dessa pegadinha para baixo aqui. Ontem, olha só, então ele subiu, depois arrebentou para baixo, fez uma pullback aqui, arrebentou para baixo de novo e hoje veio subindo, onde ele está fazendo uma nova queda aqui. Vamos ver se ele vai concluir essa queda ou não. No gráfico de 15 minutos, temos aqui uma certa consolidação. Essa região está feia pelo gráfico de 15, né? Quando a gente olha no gráfico de 60, está mais bonito. O gráfico de 30, mais bonito. Agora o de 15 não está legal não, está feio. É o mesmo range parecido aqui com o lado do Nasdaq, do S&P. Tá? Ontem aqui bacana aqui nessa queda. Vamos lá para o... Deixa eu ver. Vamos para o... Olha só, aqui nós temos um 9.1, 9.3 nesses dois candles, 9.3 nesses dois candles. Aqui poderia ser um 9.3, mas ele virou a média para cima. Se a gente desconsiderasse isso, a entrada seria aqui, ó. 9.3, o stop estaria aqui, talvez tivesse estopado aqui, porque ele virou a média para cima. Bom, não sei. Certo? Isso no 15 minutos e no 5 minutos. Ó, 5 minutos, tá vendo a consolidação chata, feia, horrorosa? Nada legal aqui, ó. Mas perdeu essa região para baixo, é o mesmo esquema que o S&P. Projeta aqui o tamanho desse range todo para baixo. Tá? Médias viradas para baixo, 200, 305, 610, média de 80, média de 21, média de 9, todo mundo virado para baixo. Então, vamos ficar atento com isso. Aqui, cara, olha só como ele mandou muito melhor aqui ontem, lá aqui no Nasdaq, né? No dia de ontem, mandou bem melhor do que o S&P ou operando S&P tomando stop. Agora sim, bom, como a gente já falou dos dois itens principais, já a gente fala sobre o Dow. Deixa eu ver o que vocês estão falando aí. Está vendido no Nasdaq desde terça-feira ao meio-dia. Está na operação até agora. Pô, Eduardo, você é um swing trader, aí tem que olhar no gráfico maior, né? Mas é aquele negócio que eu falo, né, pessoal? Ó, a entrada por swing trade, né, para estar vários dias é aqui. Aí não vai se preocupar com uma puxada dessa daqui, né? De fato, se está dentro desde terça-feira, ó, quinta, quarta, terça, meio-dia, não sei onde que ele estava meio-dia, mas vamos dizer que você entrou aqui no 15 mil. Bom, tá legal, cara. Chegou a bater no 14.700, 300 pontos para baixo. Eu estou com perspectiva de baixa, então se eu tivesse num swing trade eu continuaria vendido aqui, tá? Vendido, não, comprado, vendido. Foi o que eu entendi ali, está vendido. Ah não, está comprado? Não, Eduardo, aí não, cacete, meu, não. Comprado não pode, porra. Olha só, quinta, quarta, terça, uma queda do caramba, cara. A não ser que você comprou aqui embaixo, mas meio-dia ele não estava aqui embaixo. Vamos ver aqui no 30 minutos, meio-dia de terça-feira. Foi que dia? Terça-feira, hoje é dia... Foi 28? Peraí. Terça-feira foi dia 28. Dia 20, 27... Aqui, 28. Meio-dia. Se você comprou aqui, ainda é válido. Né? Ó, o preço, tá vendo essa linhazinha pontilhada vermelha? É onde o preço está agora. Tá? Só que, cara, tendência de queda forte, velho. E eu não acredito. Bom, pode ser que ele vá para cima, né, cara? Mas, porra, velho. Não. Nem fudendo. Não, cara. Eu tô com perspectiva de queda, meu. A queda foi muito forte. E pode continuar a queda. Ele pode voltar para cima sim, mas, sinceramente, eu não teria feito isso não. Se tivesse vendido, eu ia falar, continua, mas comprado. Bom, aí cada um faz o que acha que deve fazer, né, pessoal? Vocês são livres para isso. Olha só, o Dow, né? Temos aqui essa onda de queda forte aqui, voltou um pouquinho acima do 618, tentou ir para baixo, ontem fez um candle aqui, um martelo invertido, hoje está fazendo a mesma coisa, ainda segurando aqui em cima da média de 80 períodos, em cima deste fundo aqui, tá? E a média de 21. Se caso ele vier para perder esse fundo aqui, no 34.130, então tendência de buscar aqui o 33.650, aqui, essa região aqui, tá? Vamos ver como ele vai se comportar hoje. Bom, então, são apenas 30 empresas, por isso que ele dá essas pancadas fortes, tá vendo? Aqui foi uma pancada bem forte. Né? Vamos ver como ele vai se comportar hoje. Espera aí um pouquinho, pessoal. Bom, então aqui nos 60 minutos, anteontem nós tivemos essa queda bastante forte. Ontem ele ficou nesse range safado também, igualzinho o S&P, né? Olha só o range, muito ruim. Hoje ele tem aqui o fechamento ajustado aqui no 34.266. Temos aqui essa tendência de queda que segurou, tendência de queda não, essa onda de queda aqui que segurou em cima da média de 305, respeitando a média de 200 também, média de 9 virada para baixo, média de 21 virada para baixo, as outras médias também virada para baixo, tá? Fazendo aqui um candle de reversão, por enquanto esse candle aqui pode ser um martelinho, né? Se ele fechar aqui em cima, deixa um martelinho, candle de reversão da onda, né? Então pode dar uma continuidade. Se caso ele continuar subindo aí, eu diria o seguinte, olha, a gente pega este fundo até este topo, projeta para cima pelo gráfico de 60 minutos, aqui, deixa eu colocar o gráfico, o FIBO do gráfico de 60 minutos, para ficar numa configuração assim, ó, rompeu esse topo, buscar aqui o 34.748. Vai, não sei, temos uma resistência poderosíssima aqui, que é a média de 610, temos essa resistência aqui da média de 305, 280, 21, 9, entendeu? Temos várias resistências aqui. No meu entender, o ponto de menor resistência é para baixo, mas, né, cara, pô, sabe como é, né? Então vamos esperar ver o que ele vai fazer. Então, temos aqui até um canalzinho de alta também, igual o S&P. Podemos colocar aqui o canalzinho de alta igual o S&P aqui, ó. Olha só. Então não está um canal muito bonito não, mas é um canal de alta, certo? Podemos assumir que ele tentou romper o canal aqui, não conseguiu, está segurando aqui no suporte do canal. Ó, pode ser que ele esteja segurando aqui no suporte do canal, tá? Mas parece uma bandeira de baixa, ó, caiu, voltou na bandeira, cai de novo. Se cair, configuração igualzinho do S&P, a gente projeta essa queda aqui, ó. Tá? Então vamos dizer que ele rompe aqui agora, então a projeção é aqui embaixo, cadê? Peraí, deixa eu ver, aqui, ó. Aqui embaixo no 33.573, tá? Ele pode subir ou ele pode ir para baixo, tá? Tá desse jeito aí, eu não sei para onde ele vai, já sempre estou falando isso para vocês, tá? Nos 30, aqui 9.3, aqui um gift, aqui por enquanto não sei que pode ser isso aqui, pode ser um 9.3, enquanto se ele não virar média de 9 para cima, um 9.3, se virar média de 9 para cima, um 9.1. Interessante a busca aqui dessa alta para buscar esse topo aqui, certo? Olha só, se ele virar a média de 9 para cima. Tá? Isso aqui no 30, no 15, ó, acabou de abrir a análise aí, no 15 minutos, configuração de 9.3 aqui, aqui também um 9.3, aqui virou a média de 9 para cima, né? O stop tem que estar aqui, ó, de qualquer entrada aqui nessa região, tá? E nos 5 minutos, então, ontem também ficou aqui, ó, nesse range filho da mãe aqui, né? Zanzando aqui. Depois que o gráfico está pronto, é lindo e maravilhoso, né, pessoal? Olha só, segurou na média de 610. Entrada aqui no rompimento dessa região aqui para buscar um ponto lá embaixo. Fácil, né? Muito fácil de operar depois que o gráfico está pronto. Eu quero ver operar aqui no Skin the Game, na ao vivo e a cores, mostrando o stop, mostrando o gain, mostrando o que está acontecendo no mercado. Ninguém faz isso. Por quê? Porque sabe que toma stop. O cara que só vende gain sabe que toma stop. E aí, só que o foda é quem está olhando de fora e acredita que o cara só toma gain, né? Infelizmente tem muita gente assim. Bom, então, no gráfico de 5 minutos ele vem caindo aqui por enquanto, segurou nessa região chatinha aqui, mas vamos ver o que ele vai fazer com esse candle aqui, tá? Vamos voltar aqui para o S&P, o S&P puxando aqui, primeiro candle, vamos esperar um pouquinho, ver o que vai dar. Deixa eu ver aí o que vocês estão falando. Ó, Leonardo Silva aí, seja bem-vindo, Leonardo. Aliás, todos vocês, né, pessoal? Tá... Bom dia, S&P reagindo hoje. Vamos ver, cara, se ele vai reagir. Ó, tá dando uma puxada legal aqui, ó. Nesse momento aqui tá dando uma bela puxadinha. Vamos ver, ó. Média de 305, 200 aqui. Vamos ver o que ele vai fazer. Olha, deixou 9.1 aqui, hein, cara. Tá vendo, ó? A gente precisa treinar o olho, pessoal, para fazer as entradas corretas. Ó, 9.1. Só que no meu Trade System agora, que eu estou usando a média de 80 para balizar minhas entradas também, não entraria. Por quê? Ele está jogando contra a média de 80 aqui, ó. Tá? Então, por exemplo, aqui um 9.1 a favor da média de 80, aqui um 9.1, aqui um 9.1 a favor da média de 80. Já aqui, quando a gente olha nessa região aqui, ó, tá vendo? A média de 80 subindo, 9.1 a favor, 9.1, 9.1, 9.1, certo? Aqui 9.1 de venda, buscando a média de 80? Não, 9.1 a favor. Se bem que não deu muito legal, mas é isso. Então você tem que colocar o seu Trade System a favor das suas operações. Entendeu o que eu quis dizer, né? Então, deixa eu ver o Eduardão. Ô Eduardo, ó, presta atenção, cara. Com relação a essa operação que você está fazendo, cara, avalia antes, não leva só a minha opinião em consideração, avalia antes para saber se você vai sair ou se você vai ficar. Por quê? É aquilo que eu sempre falo. A questão de compra e venda é muito da sua leitura, porque você pode comprar e vender em qualquer lugar e ele dá bom, entendeu? Então faz a sua avaliação, não vai só pelo que eu falei, tá? Faz a sua avaliação. E aí, se você achar que por algum motivo, por alguma técnica, ó, como ele vem puxando forte para cima aqui o Nasdaq, por algum motivo, por alguma técnica, ele vai voltar, então aí é a sua avaliação, entendeu? Porque você precisa ter aí a sua leitura do mercado e saber se vai valer a pena ou não manter dentro daquela operação. Eu falei por mim, né? Quem entra no swing trade não pode se incomodar com uma barra dessa daqui, porque você tem que olhar o gráfico diário e o menor gráfico que você vai olhar é o 60 ou 120 minutos. Tá? Então pensa um pouquinho nisso daí, tá bom? Fala aí, RD, beleza, cara? Seja bem-vindo, aliás, todos vocês, né, pessoal? Olha só, deixou um 9.1 aqui também, ó. Aqui, ó, 9.1 ativado. Jogando contra a média de 80, eu falei que eu não entraria contra a média de 80. Esse daqui eu teria entrado para a venda, mas aqui para a compra eu não teria entrado. Tá? Mas se a gente olhar aqui, ó, pode ser que a gente colocasse aqui uma... Não, mas essa LTA ficaria mais bonita aqui, ó. Aquela ali não ficaria muito bonita não, mas olha essa LTA aqui, cara. Olha só essa LTA do gráfico de 5 minutos. Depois ele entrou numa LTBzinha ali. A gente pode traçar uma linha aqui assim? Pode, cara. Vai funcionar? Tá funcionando por enquanto, né? Olha só. também. Rompeu LTB aqui. Lembra que eu tinha falado aqui, ó, a projeção desse cara para o lado que rompesse? Na verdade, eu não falei para o lado que rompesse, né? Mas olha só. Ó, já está chegando no alvo aqui, ó. Rompeu para cima, já deu alvo. Já foi. O alvo aí já era. É isso, galera. Acontece, cara. Ô, cabaço. Já foi. Olha lá. Já bateu numa vez, rompendo aqui. Às vezes a gente precisa fazer as operações entrar sem medo, né, cara? Mas, pô, às vezes o risco também deixa a gente com medo. Não tem jeito, meu. Aí eu entendo o seguinte, galera. Muitas vezes é que assim, é que eu vou falar uma palavra que vai parecer um pouco de, não sei se vai parecer arrogância, o que vai parecer. É fácil fazer uma operação? É fácil. Né? Se você tiver um trade system apropriado, né, e se concentrar direitinho, conseguir visualizar as operações quando elas estão ocorrendo de fato. Por exemplo, setup 9.1, 9.2, o Nasdaq aqui foi embora, cara, rompeu. Eu entraria no rompimento aqui? Eu não entraria. Mas olha só, ele rompeu no 825 e está ali no 870. Então nós estamos falando aí, ó, tá indo mais, ó, 50 pontos, são 100 dólares. É fácil de você fazer isso? Mas o medo às vezes não deixa, porque você está esperando ele vir para baixo. Entende? Quando dá para você entrar, mas você fica com medo? Ó, ele bateu, foi lá, cara. Então aqui é uma técnica, você pega a consolidação, rompeu para um lado, entra. Mas, por exemplo, se você entra nesse rompimento aqui, teria tomado stop. Ele rompeu aqui para cima, deu gain. Tivesse entrado com aqui, o stop aqui na mínima, teria dado gain aqui de 100 dólares nessa brincadeira. Mas é aquilo, no simulador é fácil de você fazer operação, mas na conta real não é. Não é porque o medo de perder dinheiro acaba nos afetando e acaba fazendo a gente perder, às vezes, até mais. Tá? Ontem, por exemplo, eu tentei entrar sem medo nas operações. Eu estava com viés de baixa. Entrei todas vendas. E o mercado ficou ruim pra caramba. Olha aqui, ó. Ó, veio aqui e rompeu, tá vendo? Se você entra nesse rompimento, tinha tomado o stop. Jogando contra a média de 80, 200, 305, média de 610. A mesma coisa aconteceu aqui no Nasdaq, ó. Jogando contra a média de 200, 305, média de 610 lá em cima, certo? Entendeu? Não tem, não é muito, não é muito, não é intuitivo, não é intuitivo, tá? É contra-intuitivo as operações, na minha opinião. Tá? Porque você poderia ter arriscado e ter dado bom. Aqui no Nasdaq deu, no S&P não deu. A mesma operação, os dois romperam. A mesma coisa, média de 200, média de 305, média de 610, LTB. Entendeu? Aí você vai entender o quê? Cara, eu tô vendo que o mercado tá indo para baixo, eu vou querer operar a favor do mercado, né? Tá indo para baixo. Então, eu vou tentar operações que vão para baixo. Aí tem aqueles dias que o mercado tá ruim, como ontem, aqui. O mercado estava ruim. Olha como ele ficou aqui nos 5 minutos. Ó, eu tentei uma venda aqui, tomei stop. Conta real, tá? Tentei uma venda aqui, tomei um stop. Eu estava esperando venda. Olha aqui, ó. Olha só, ele vinha caindo aqui. Tá, tudo bem. Fala, pô, tá longe da média de 80. Poderia ser um parâmetro para eu entrar. Não, tá, não vou entrar porque está muito longe da média de 80. Poderia usar como um parâmetro. Aí não teria entrado. Beleza, um ponto. Falei, cara, ó, tá caindo aqui, fez pullback até a média de 21, aqui fez pullback até a média de 21, vai continuar caindo? Vou entrar, cara. Se perder essa mínima aqui, abriu a análise, perdeu essa mínima aqui, vou entrar. Perdeu a mínima aqui, fiz a minha entrada, ele veio aqui, pum, me estopou. Aí eu, puta merda, já tava bravo e tal, né? Aí depois fez esses dois caras aqui, que eram 9,3. Falei, cara, se perder a mínima desse cara aqui, ele vai continuar caindo, porque é a sombra que ele deixou para cima. Então, coloquei minha entrada aqui. Bem aqui. Pumba, outro stop. Aí eu, puta merda, meu, fiquei bravo pra caramba. Aí ele foi, subiu aqui, veio caindo, rompeu aqui essa consolidação. Falei, cara, olha só, aqui, se ele romper para baixo aqui, bater, fizer um pullback até a média de 21, virar para baixo, vou entrar de novo. Foi o que eu fiz. Entrei aqui, ó. E quem não acompanhou isso aí, pode ir lá na live de ontem, tá gravado, cara, conta real. Você vê aqui, ó, trade simulado, simulador. Lá estava escrito Amp Live, que é a conta real. Aí ele veio aqui, deixou essa estrela cadente aqui, entrada perfeita. Só que o mercado estava ruim. Aí ele veio aqui, pegou, foi lá, me estopou. Eu, puta que pariu, meu. Aí no finalzinho do dia, de novo, cadê? No finalzinho do dia foi... eu acho que a minha entrada foi aqui, cara, ó. Se eu não me engano. Acho que foi isso mesmo. Minha entrada foi aqui, ó. Entrei aqui, aí, né, um 9,3 aqui de venda. Aí esse cara aqui, a corretora me estopou. Tá? Foi a última entrada. Então, quer dizer, estava ruim, eu não consegui perceber que o mercado estava ruim para operar ontem. Por mais que você fale assim, ah, mas quem entrou aqui, saiu aqui, pegou 20 pontos. Legal, mas eu estava com a cabeça de venda, eu não conseguia entender que o mercado estava muito feio. Olha só como é que ele se comportou ontem aqui dentro. Aqui, ó, subiu, caiu, subiu, caiu. Quer dizer, o cara que tem a habilidade de conseguir pegar, não vou falar que não tem, é mais difícil, mas o cara que consegue pegar a virada do mercado, porra, o cara consegue ganhar muita grana, mas é muito difícil. Então, vamos dizer que de 1 milhão de traders, aí, 0,5% faz isso? 5 mil, que já é gente pra caralho? Tá entendendo? Então, eu não tive isso daí. Eu vou pegar minha nota de corretagem e vou mostrar para vocês como é que ficou ontem. Ó, veio para baixo, volta para cima. Ainda é válido a entrada por aqui? Olha só. Né? Falei, né? Você espelha essa onda para baixo, ó, o alvo aqui no 51, do 61 51, mas tá feio. O Nasdaq aqui, como é que tá? Vamos ver o Nasdaq aqui. Ó, o Nasdaq, beleza, foi, voltou, tá deixando 9,3 por enquanto aqui, média de 9 virada para cima, tá legal. Deixa eu colocar, pera aí um pouquinho, pessoal. Deixa eu fazer um negócio aqui para melhorar. O que eu preciso colocar? Deixa eu fechar esse cara aqui, rapidão. Sem estresse, pessoal, sem estresse, porque, cara, já me estressei demais ontem. O que eu preciso fazer aqui? Peraí, deixa eu ver uma coisa aqui. Faz o esquema das blogueirinhas aí, pessoal. Já sabe qual é, né? Se inscrever no canal, ativar o sininho, dar like, compartilhar. Vocês já sabem, tudo isso daí, pô. Eu vou pegar aqui a minha nota de corretagem para mostrar para vocês, tá? Aqui no US Futures você não vai encontrar mentirinha tentando te enganar não, cara. É a pura verdade do que acontece no mercado financeiro. Não criemos ilusão de que o mercado financeiro não dá para ganhar dinheiro. Dá para ganhar muito dinheiro, mas vamos tirar a ilusão de que é facinho. Não é facinho. Tem uma série de habilidades que a gente precisa desenvolver até que o mercado fique fácil, tá? É uma série de habilidades que a gente precisa desenvolver para que o mercado fique de fato fácil. Alguns traders vão conseguir facilmente fazer operações vencedoras? Eu acredito que sim, que vão haver traders que conseguem fazer operações muito fáceis de gain. Mas é uma habilidade que leva algum tempo para desenvolver. Não vai ser da noite para o dia. Ninguém consegue da noite para o dia. Pode até existir pode até ser que exista. Mas, cara, vamos ser sinceros. A maioria vai perder dinheiro, que é o que acontece. E o cara que ganha, de fato, é o ponto fora da curva. Que existe, né? Toda regra tem a sua exceção. tá? Então não é diferente aqui no mercado financeiro. Espera aí, eu estou pegando aqui, pessoal, espera só um pouquinho. Vou pegar aqui minha nota de corretagem para mostrar a vocês como ficou feio ontem. Eu não tenho vergonha de mostrar não, cara. Aqui você só vai encontrar a verdade, como eu sempre falo. Falou, Eduardo, não vi antes, cara. Até mais. Bom descanso. Fala, Afonso, beleza, cara? Seja bem-vindo. Aliás, todos vocês, né, pessoal? Tá? Então aqui, cara, você sempre vai encontrar um cara que fala a verdade, que mostra toda a verdade do mercado financeiro. Quer ilusão, vai ter que ir lá no canal do Croissant Boy. Tá? Aqui você vai encontrar coisa verdadeira. Só um minutinho, hein? Espera aí um pouquinho. Aí, pera aí que eu vou mostrar a tela cheia aqui para vocês. Aqui. Então, deixa eu abrir a tela aqui. Bom, então vocês estão vendo aqui minha nota de corretagem, tá? Olha só, ontem foram 4 operações e eu consegui fazer 4 operações perdedoras, tá? Então o total das minhas operações, ó, todas no micro S&P, tá vendo? Eu acho que tá conseguindo enxergar aí, cara. Dá para ver? Tá? Então todas as operações perdedoras, acabei devendo aqui 97 doletas aqui. E aí ficou assim, ó, 97 doletas de loss aqui e com 6 dólares de corretagem, tá? Aqui, ó, total commission and fees. Então, fazendo aqui 103 dólares de loss, né? Tá procurando ter gain aqui, tá? E sobrou isso aqui, ó. Agora tem que esperar para colocar mais grana lá. Certo? Então é mais ou menos isso, certo? Então, acontece, cara, fazer o quê? Não é uma fortuna, também não é pouco dinheiro, né? Se a gente pensar que 100 dólares dá mais de 500 reais, é de foder o peão, né? Certo? Então que nós temos aqui um 9.3 ativado aqui, ó. Tá? 9.3 segurou em cima da média de 305, sei lá. É isso aí, ó, escuta o Mesquita aí, galera. Dá like nessa porra aí, meu. Bom, o S&P segurando dentro desse range filho da mãe aqui, né? Feio, veio para baixo, voltou, veio de novo, voltou, tá horrível. O Nasdaq tá melhor que ele tá andando. O Nasdaq tá aproveitando ali o tesouro nota de 10 anos que está caindo, isso favorece entendam bem, não é os juros do tesouro de 10 anos é que quando cai faz com que o Nasdaq suba, tá? Então olha só mais uma dica que eu dei para vocês aí, hein? Deixa eu mostrar aqui para vocês novamente, deixa eu pegar aqui, ó. Ele tá zerado ali por enquanto, vou esperar mais um pouquinho. O PMI veio ruim, hein? O PMI veio 64,7, esperado era 65. Nada do outro mundo, mas veio ruinzinho. Deixa eu dar um refresh na página ali, ver se ele carrega o tesouro. Esperar um pouquinho para ver se ele carrega. O Dow. Olha, o Dow rompeu aquela região que eu tinha falado para vocês, né? Ó, esse canal aqui rompeu para baixo, tá fazendo um pullback em cima do canal. Deixou um 9.1, parou aqui no fechamento ajustado. Vamos ver se ele vai fazer aí uma volta para buscar o topo lá do canal, que aí no caso seria essa região aqui, ou se é só um pullback para perder de vez aqui o canal, que na minha opinião é uma bandeira, e vai tacar o mercado para baixo. O Russell a gente não está nem falando direito, né, cara? O Russell, talvez eu deixe de olhar o Russell. É muito ativo para ficar olhando, cara. Fica difícil para a gente conciliar todos os ativos, principalmente quando a gente não tem uma tela grande. Porque se você tem uma tela grandona, você deixa lá 4 janelas, né? Um Russell, um Dow, um Nasdaq, um S&P, deixa as 4 lá. E aí você fica de olho nos 4, né? Batendo o olho. Agora, quando você tem que ficar passando de janela para janela aqui, aí fica mais difícil da gente conseguir ver as oportunidades. Mas olha só, 9.3 aqui, hein, cara, no Dow. 9.3 pode ser uma entrada aqui no Dow por 9.3. O Nasdaq andou melhor. Ó, o Nasdaq andou muito melhor. 9.3 a entrada aqui, já tinha falado para vocês. Se eu tivesse entrado no 9.3 no Nasdaq aqui, eu sairia aqui próximo da média de 610, que é uma média importante. Tá? Sairia ali sim. Esse cara aqui, ó como ele tá, meu, feio. Ó, tentou romper para baixo, não conseguiu, tentou romper para cima, voltou, tentou romper para baixo, tentou romper para cima. A gente pode até expandir mais esse cara aqui, ó. Mas horrível, né, meu? Feio demais. Não, aqui eu vou deixar assim mesmo. Essa região aqui. Certo? Tá bem feio aí. O Nasdaq super para cima, o Dow aqui. Se perder aqui a mínima desse candle, vamos esperar fechar para ver como é que ele vai ficar. Se ele fechar abaixo da média de 9, é um 9.3, porque não vira a média de 9 para cima. Se fechar acima, começa a ser um 9.1. Só que jogar contra a média de 80 e a média de 20 não vai ser muito legal. Certo? Ó, o Nasdaq parece que está querendo ir bacana, hein? Deixa eu ver aqui o Dow no gráfico de 30. O Dow, olha, eu tô achando que ele vai conseguir romper essa região aí, para baixo. Olha como ele está aqui no gráfico de 30. Só fazendo esse candle amplo. Fechando aqui abaixo, eu acho interessante. 9.3 aqui e aqui um gift também. 9.3 pode gerar um gift também, né? 9.3 alvo por gift aqui, ó. Ó, ele veio na projeção de 618, segurou no fechamento ajustado, mas o alvo aqui no 34.215. Isso aí pelo gráfico de 30 minutos. Já já a gente procura o vídeo do Powell falando. Para um 9.3 aqui, ele não pode fechar acima da média de 9. Se fechar acima da média de 9, é um 9.1. Agora, quem não sabe aí o que é um 9.3, tem vídeo aqui no canal falando sobre o setup 9.3. Dá uma corridinha lá para conferir. 9.3, 9.2, 9.1. O Nasdaq segurou, tá vendo? Segurando em cima da média de 610 é passar calor à toa, né, cara? O S&P indo para cima, será que ele rompe aqui essa região? Mas contra a média de 610, né? Para uma operação legal aqui com referência a essa consolidação seria esse cenário aqui. Então ele está subindo, vem aqui mais ou menos, sei lá, até os 75 aqui, faz pullback até aqui em cima, vira para ir para cima. Aí a entrada no rompimento da máxima desse cara aqui, buscando o alvo desse cara aqui, seria aqui para cima, uma vez essa distância aqui, seria lá no 84, do 71 a 84. Certo? Esse seria um alvo possível. Mas ele pode romper essa região e ir embora sem parar? Pode. Pode, é pouco provável, mas pode acontecer. E se ele deixa um candlezinho aí, e se ele deixa um gift em cima desse cara aqui, ó. Por exemplo, aqui, ó, vira um gift. Entrada nessa máxima aqui. Um gift, um 9.2. Certo? Entrada na máxima buscando aí que ele vá lá em cima. De fato, segurou em cima da média de 610, pode voltar, cara. Olha, é LTB aqui, ó, dessa linha verde aqui, é uma LTB dos 60 minutos. Ó, carregou ali ó, o tesouro, deixa eu mostrar aqui para vocês. Então, quando o tesouro está para cima, aqui, ó, esse é a remuneração. Então, aqui está dizendo que o tesouro de 10 anos, para quem comprasse hoje o papel, ele renderia 1,54% ao ano. Então, você coloca lá 100 dólares, no ano que vem vai ter $101,54. No outro ano, assim sucessivamente, tá? Então, quando esse cara está muito alto, o valor está muito alto, o Nasdaq cai. Quando está baixo, o Nasdaq sobe. Depois eu vou fazer um videozinho explicando por quê. Certo, pessoal? Ó, o S&P. Tá vendo como tá foda? Olha lá, ó, tentou romper, não conseguiu. Olha a puxada que ele deu. Você pode tentar, diante desse cenário aqui, fazer uma venda aqui? Pode. Vai dar bom? Depende. Tá? Então você viu, ele rompeu, coloca a venda aqui. Com a saída, pelo menos aqui na metade, talvez. Na metade, ou mais arriscado, tentar buscar aqui essa região, aqui o 59, que dá uma bela pontuação, né? Então, exemplo, entrada no 71, saída no 59, são 12 pontos. Vai dar bom? É aquilo que eu estou falando. Talvez. Né? É uma estratégia. Você pode fazer ou pode não. Certo? Pensa nisso um pouquinho. Olha, virou a média de 9 para baixo. Eu ainda tô aqui, cara. Tô pensando no down ainda, velho. Olha só, ele fez 3 candles aqui. Pena que esse cara virou a média de 9 para cima, né? Aí desconfigurou o 9.3, mas está fazendo aqui um 9.1 na virada, ou 9.4, pode chamar isso de 9.4. 9.1, 9.4 vai dar na mesma. Não, na mesma não, é que o 9.4 ele configura quando um candle vira a média de 9 para cima e o outro vira para baixo. Certo? Se ela estava caindo, que nem aqui, ó. Ela está caindo aqui. Aí esse candle virou para cima e esse candle já virou para baixo. Mas olha como ele puxou forte aqui, o down. Eu tô a fim de entrar aqui no down, cara. E espelhar essa onda toda para baixo. Ó, pegar daqui até aqui, no espelhamento, uma vez para baixo, uma entrada depois desse cara aí. Não importa onde ele parar. Tá? Buscando aqui o 34,92. Vamos ver, vou colocar até a vendinha aqui. Depois, quando ele parar ali, eu puxo a venda para cima. Depois que ele estiver pertinho do zero aqui, eu já puxo a venda para cima. E aqui é um pouco arriscado, porque é o fechamento ajustado aqui. Nós temos esses fundinhos aqui embaixo, ó. E olha só como vem... Cara, busquei aqui, ó. Essa região aqui, ó. Esse fundo aqui. Vai dar certo, não vai? Boa pergunta. Sei. Vamos ver. Fecha. 2, 1. Ai, porra! Ah, pegou. Vamos ver. O meu stop, cara, tem que estar aqui acima da média de 9, velho. É um stop um pouco caro. Tá? Stop tem que estar acima da média de 9, não tem jeito. Proteger. Cadê? Foi? Ó, stop acima da média de 9. O alvo, nosso alvo bem lá embaixo, vamos ver. Tinha falado o alvo aqui, né? Que vai coincidir com este fundo aqui, ó. Ah, não. Não, não é não. Mentira. O alvo que coincide com este fundo aqui, ó. Vou colocar uma linha ali. De repente ele parar neste fundo aqui, eu saio neste fundo aqui, tá? Então vou colocar essa linha aqui para a gente identificar este fundo. Se ele parar aí nesse fundo, a gente sobe o nosso stop. Lembrando, né, fechamento ajustado é um ponto até que importante, tá? Ele pode respeitar o fechamento ajustado aqui, ó. Se ele respeitar o fechamento ajustado, pode até estopar, ficar segurando em cima. Vamos ver se ele consegue romper. E pelo gráfico de 60 minutos, se configurar de fato aqui o rompimento, lembrem-se que ele dá um alvo. Deixa eu colocar no gráfico de 60 para a gente visualizar. Olha só, veio rompendo, a entrada seria mais aqui em cima, né, no 308, 20 pontos para cima. O alvo aí, já tinha mostrado para vocês, é aqui. Nossa, é super lá embaixo, né? Aqui, ó, no... Esse cara aqui, ó. No 33.570 seria o alvo que desse rompimento aqui, ó. Fala, Rafa! Bom dia, cara. Seja bem-vindo. Então, o Rafa Mesquita chamo de Mesquita e o Rafa chamo só de Rafa. Vamos ver se vai. 9.4. Lembrem-se que o stop do 9.4 correto aqui em cima, mas é um stop bastante caro, mas deveria ser considerado lá em cima, né? 100 pontos dá 50 dólares. Questão de margem é um problema, viu, cara? São 10 pontos, tomar um stop aqui já mata meu 10 pontos de dólar, né? No caso, 10 pontos de S&P. Vamos ver. Acredita operador, cara, não tem jeito, né? Tem que acreditar que o mercado vai lá. Não dá, Rafa. Não tem criptomoeda lá. Não tem não. Para operar criptomoeda vai na Binance, pô. Deixa eu ver aqui, ó. Vamos olhar aqui. Eu sempre olho porque às vezes o cara acha que eu tô de má vontade, sei lá, né? Deixa eu colocar aqui para vocês verem que não tem. Trading Info, Margins, ó, micro contratos, aqui índices de ações, né? Então temos vários índices de ações aqui, moedas, né? Pares de moedas, todas contra o dólar, tá? Aqui energia, petróleo, gás, certo? Aqui os metais, ouro, cobre, prata. Aqui os financeiros, que são os tesouros, né? Ó, tesouro, nota de 10 anos aqui, ó. Certo? Aqui margem de swing, aqui margem de day trade, grãos, e aqui softs é algodão, essas paradas, café, aqui lá, e carne. Tá? Então não tem. Beleza? Tem não. Para operar criptomoedas, vai ter que ir em outra corretora. Bom, estou aqui, né, cara, no Dow Jones, tá? Micro Dow Jones. Estou buscando aqui o rompimento desse canalzão aqui, tá? Estou buscando o rompimento do canalzão. Pode dar bom, pode não dar, né, pessoal? Que, se eu soubesse, sempre entraria nos ganhos. Segurando aqui em cima do fechamento ajustado, e eu estou buscando o alvo aqui, uma vez essa ondinha de queda aqui, ó, estou buscando ela uma vez para baixo. Certo? O Nasdaq, como é que está o Nasdaq? O Nasdaq já deu alvo lá em cima, né, daqui dessa zona de consolidação, já tinha falado para vocês. Deu um 9.3 aqui com saída aqui em cima também, que já deu alvo. Agora ele vem voltando essa região aqui, não está muito bacana não. O S&P tentou romper para cima, tentou ir para baixo, tá vendo o que eu tinha falado? A entrada possível poderia ser aqui a venda, agora aqui tem uma possível compra? Tem, possível compra, vai dar certo? Não sai, sabemos, não sei, tá? Então uma saída para cá, possível compra aqui nessa região, tentando buscar aqui a metade da zona de consolidação. E o Dow eu espero que ele vá lá embaixo, cara. Vá lá me dar um alvo maravilhoso. É isso que eu quero que o Dow faça. Ele vai fazer o que eu quero? Bom, não sei também. O discurso do Fed. Obrigado, Mesquita. Vamos dar uma olhada aqui. Deixa eu ver se eu acho ali na minha outra tela. Qualquer coisa eu jogo aqui. Não vamos perder o Dow de vista, tá? Discurso do Fed. Vamos ver. Deixa eu colocar aqui. Ainda bem que você me lembrou. Obrigado. Nossa, o Down puxando forte, hein, cara. Deixa eu colocar o filtro aqui ao vivo. Cadê? Ao vivo. Ah, alegria, alegria, caralho. Vou colocar aqui. Deixa eu ver se tá aberto.
Swiftly moved to enact the American Rescue Plan, which provided $1.9 trillion to address the impacts of COVID-19. The legislation included billions in funding to support individuals and families, including renters, homeowners, and people experiencing homelessness, as well as small businesses during this crisis. We're also working together to put President Biden's Build Back Better agenda into action by making long overdue investments into the nation's housing programs, child care, education, workforce, and other critical aspects of our economy, all while being completely paid for. Democrats are also working to address the past failures of the Trump administration's approach to the pandemic. For example, we're working with Secretary Yellen and the Treasury Department to correct administratively burdensome requirements initiated by Republicans that made it harder for renters and landlords to obtain relief in the earlier versions of the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. My legislation, the Expediting Assistance to Renters and Landlords Act of 2021, would further speed up relief and cut down unnecessary barriers that are standing in the way of aid for renters and landlords. Of course, the Federal Reserve has also played a part in the response to the pandemic through the creation of emergency facilities to help tackle the crisis until they were prematurely shut down by former Secretary Mnuchin. These facilities played a vital role in stabilizing financial markets last year. Moving forward, our committee is committed to exploring ideas to ensure that facilities like these can more directly protect workers and support small businesses, as well as state and local governments the next time there is a crisis. Amid Democrats' continuing efforts to ensure that relief reaches communities across the country and that our economy is strong for the future, Republicans continue to operate recklessly. Even now, Republicans are threatening to throw the economy into unnecessary turmoil by blocking legislation to suspend the debt ceiling. It's completely unacceptable for Republicans to hold our nation's economy hostage, especially in the middle of this continuing public health crisis, and when fully 1/4 of the increase in the debt ceiling is attributed to Trump's tax scam for the rich. Secretary Yellen, Chair Powell, I expect to hear your thoughts on these issues and to hear more about what will happen if Republicans force the country to default. I also look forward to discussing your ongoing work to respond to the pandemic today. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, for 5 minutes.
Today, the Financial Services Committee is holding its second statutorily required quarterly hearing on the Biden administration's pandemic response. Now, the only problem is that this hearing should have occurred in actually the second quarter. It's the third quarter. But then again, that just perfectly encapsulates the incompetence and dysfunction of a Democrat-run Washington, where Democrats run the House, the Senate, and the White House. So let's just review briefly. The incompetence of the rental assistance program, which Republicans have highlighted since March, there's no solution in sight. The so-called Biden agenda appears to be, well, on the rocks. And Democrats are no closer to raising the debt ceiling ahead of the October 18th deadline than they were in August when it expired. And what do all of these problems have in common? They were foreseeable. They are known things, not just to Democrats, but to the world. And now markets are taking notice. Our allies, our adversaries, are watching closely to see what happens next. But in the midst of this chaos, we at least have you two individuals in your respective seats. And the two of you instill confidence in our financial system, especially in a moment like this. And that credibility of your institution is deeply connected with each one of you right now. Chairman Powell, your decisive action helped prevent the worst of the economic impacts of COVID. You were thoughtful, deliberate, and transparent. The antithesis, I would say, of dangerous. And to think otherwise is frankly reckless and unmoored from reality. And anyone who would say that, frankly, I appreciate their courage to speak their truth. Chairman Powell, our country will be better off with your continued leadership at the Federal Reserve. Secretary Yellen, your experience as Fed chair and steady hand throughout the financial crisis, and then as your term as chair of the Fed, made you a natural pick for the Treasury Department, and I'm glad you're in your seat. So that's why I'm sorry you're in such a bad situation given this administration's strategy. Bad strategy and worse fiscal plan from a Democrat-run Washington will have consequences, I believe. Consumer prices continue to rise, businesses can't find workers, and the government, because of overspending, will not be able to pay its bills in a little more than 2 weeks. So what's the plan? All I've heard from Democrats this year is a plan to spend more money. $2 trillion in March, more than $5 trillion now, and $5 trillion was a compromise, I want to remind you. Bernie Sanders and the progressives wanted a $6 trillion reconciliation package. And President Biden proposed a $6 trillion budget in June, but Democrats couldn't agree on that either. So here we are. To be clear, the Biden administration's Treasury Department can't even keep track of the $46 billion of rental assistance. So how are the American people supposed to trust Democrats with another $5.5 trillion? This isn't a plan. Frankly, it's a heist. The Democrat-run Washington tax and spend policies will only increase prices more for consumers. And they're using you, Madam Secretary, and your credibility to sell this bad agenda. Over the last several weeks, you've called on Congress to address the debt limit. I couldn't agree more. Yesterday, the House passed a debt ceiling bill that is doomed in the Senate. It was political theater, and they know it, we know it, and the American people, in fact, know it as well. It's theater designed to distract Americans from the fact that Democrats have no idea how to govern. They've known this deadline was coming. They knew it the day they took control of the Senate. They knew it the day that President Biden was sworn into office, and they knew it the day that the Treasury Secretary was confirmed. The Democrats have been in charge of our country for nearly a year, and they did nothing to prepare for this moment. Well, except spend more money and bring the date forward by which we have to address the debt ceiling. And I want to be clear, the U.S. government is run and controlled by Democrats. It is defined by dysfunction, incompetence, and fiscal irresponsibility. Late in the game, asking Republicans to bail out your agenda so you can pass more spending is frankly absurd. This is no way to run the country. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member McHenry. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Green, for 1 minute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, we must raise the debt ceiling. Raising the debt ceiling does not authorize new spending. Raising the debt ceiling allows the United States to pay its existing debts. Congress has raised or suspended the debt ceiling on a bipartisan basis 78 times since 1960. There are no secret weapons in the Treasury's arsenal that will save us from default if this body fails to act responsibly and swiftly. Madam Chair, we've passed a CARES Act and other pandemic relief legislation. Let us come together again and stand behind the debts of our nation with the full faith and credit of the United States of America. We must raise the debt ceiling. I yield back.
I now want to welcome our distinguished witnesses today, who I believe need little introduction to members of the committee. First, I want to welcome the Honorable Janet Yellen, Secretary of the United States Department of the Treasury, who has served in that role since her confirmation in January of this year. Our other distinguished witness today is the Honorable Jerome Powell, the Chair of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, and who has served in that role since February of 2018. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. You will have 5 minutes to summarize your testimony. You should be able to see a timer on the screen in front of you that will indicate how much time you have left in your testimony. Secretary Yellen, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you. Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, members of the committee, it's a pleasure to testify today. We're in the midst of a fragile but rapid recovery from the pandemic-induced recession. While our economy continues to expand and recapture a substantial share of the jobs lost during 2020, significant challenges from the Delta variant continue to suppress the speed of recovery and present substantial barriers to a vibrant economy. Still, I remain optimistic about the medium-term trajectory of our economy, and I expect we will return to full employment next year. A rebound like this was never a foregone conclusion. In fact, the American recovery is stronger than those of other wealthy nations. One key factor for our overperformance is the policy choices that Congress has made over the past 18 months. Those choices include the passage of the CARES Act, the Consolidated Appropriations Act, and the American Rescue Plan. Treasury, as you know, was tasked with administering a large portion of the relief dollars in those bills. And when we last met, our department was busy standing up programs to help individual families, state governments, and organizations of every size in between. While we still have much more work to do, we have made significant progress, and I wanted to give you an update. Let's start with families. In July, our department started sending the monthly expanded child tax credit payments to the families of nearly 60 million children across the country. To date, $46 billion in payments have been made, and we're already seeing the impact. Analysis by the Census Bureau found that after the first payments in July, food insecurity among families with children dropped 24%. As for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, COVID-19 decimated their budgets. There were mass layoffs, and to end the health and economic emergencies, we knew that communities would need funding to hire educators to bring kids back to school, for example, or frontline workers to administer the vaccine. The American Rescue Plan included $350 billion to that end, and those dollars are indeed helping the machinery of local governments get up and running. States and localities can rely on relief money that's available instead of resorting to painful budget cuts. Congress rightly designed the state and local program with flexibility in mind. I think many of us knew the recovery could run up against some unforeseen challenges, and we wanted communities to be able to devote resources where and when they saw fit. I want to note that this flexibility is paying off now, especially with the spread of the Delta variant. Harris County, Texas, for instance, has used this funding to boost its immunization rate, offering $100 to each person who gets their first vaccine dose. For the relief dollars not yet out the door, Treasury is doing everything it can to expedite their delivery. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program is one example. Prior to the pandemic, there was essentially no national infrastructure to get money from government coffers to renters and landlords. Building that infrastructure has been a massive undertaking for states, localities, and tribes. The program is scaling up quickly, with 1.4 million payments made to help struggling renters keep a roof over their heads. Still, too much of the money remains bottlenecked at the state and local levels. That's why our Treasury team has worked to eliminate every piece of red tape possible in order to ensure more payments can get to renters and landlords. But states and localities must also work to remove barriers that can speed up distribution of rental assistance funds. I'll end my remarks there, except to say this. It is imperative that Congress address the debt limit. If not, our current estimate is that Treasury will likely exhaust its extraordinary measures by October 18th. At that point, we expect Treasury would be left with very limited resources that would be depleted quickly. America would default for the first time in history. The full faith and credit of the United States would be impaired, and our country would likely face a financial crisis and economic recession as a result. We must address this issue to honor commitments made by this and prior Congresses, including those made to address the health and economic impact of the pandemic. It's necessary to avert a catastrophic event for our economy. Representatives, the debt ceiling has been raised or suspended 78 times since 1960, almost always on a bipartisan basis. My hope is that we can work together to do so again and to build a stronger American economy for future generations. Thank you, and I'm pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Chair Powell, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to present your testimony.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, Ranking Member McHenry, and other members of the committee for the opportunity to discuss the measures we have taken to address the hardship wrought by the pandemic. Since we last met, the economy has continued to strengthen. Real GDP rose at a robust pace in the first half of the year, and growth is widely expected to continue at a strong pace in the second half. The sectors most adversely affected by the pandemic have improved in recent months, but the rise in COVID-19 cases has slowed the recovery. Household spending rose at an especially rapid pace over the first half of the year, but flattened out in July and August as spending softened in COVID-sensitive sectors. Additionally, in some industries, near-term supply constraints are restraining activity. As with overall economic activity, conditions in the labor market have continued to improve. Demand for labor is very strong, and job gains averaged 750,000 per month over the past 3 months. In August, however, gains slowed markedly, with the slowdown concentrated in sectors most sensitive to the pandemic. The unemployment rate was 5.2% in August, and this figure understates the shortfall in employment, particularly as participation in the labor market has not moved up from the low rates that have prevailed for most of the past year. Factors related to the pandemic appear to be weighing on employment growth. These factors should diminish with progress on containing the virus. The economic downturn has not fallen equally on all Americans, and those least able to shoulder the burden have been the hardest hit. In particular, despite progress, joblessness continues to fall disproportionately on lower wage workers in the service sector and on African Americans and Hispanics. Inflation is elevated and will likely remain so in coming months before moderating. As the economy continues to reopen, we are seeing upward pressure on prices, particularly due to supply bottlenecks in some sectors. These effects have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, but they will abate, and as they do, inflation is expected to drop back toward our longer-run 2% goal. The process of reopening the economy is unprecedented. As it continues, bottlenecks, hiring difficulties, and other constraints could again prove to be greater and more enduring than anticipated, posing upside risks to inflation. If sustained higher inflation were to become a serious concern, we would certainly respond and use our tools to ensure levels that are consistent with our goal. The path of the economy continues to depend on the course of the virus, and risks to the outlook remain. The Delta variant has led to a surge in cases, causing human suffering and slowing the recovery. Continued progress on vaccinations would support a return to more normal economic conditions. The Fed's policy actions are guided by our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices, along with our responsibilities to promote the stability of the financial system. In response to the crisis, we took broad and forceful measures to support the flow of credit and to promote the stability of the financial system. Our actions taken together helped unlock more than $2 trillion of funding to support businesses large and small, nonprofits, and state and local governments between April and December of 2020. This helped keep organizations from shuttering and put employers in a better position to keep workers on and to hire them back as the recovery continues. These programs have served as a backstop to key credit markets and helped to restore the flow of credit from private lenders. We have deployed them to an unprecedented extent. Our emergency lending tools require the approval of the Treasury and are available only in unusual and exigent circumstances, such as those brought on by this crisis. Many of these programs were supported by CARES Act funding. Those facilities provided essential support through a very difficult year and are now closed. The Fed completed its sales of assets from the secondary market corporate credit facility on August 31. We were able to wind down the facility rapidly and efficiently with no adverse impact on credit conditions. We also recently closed the PPPLF to new lending and are managing the pay down of assets in our other CARES Act facilities as they wind down. We continue to analyze their efficacy and to review the lessons learned. The Fed's actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We will do all we can to support the economy for as long as it takes. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Chair Powell. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Secretary Yellen, your department reports that as of August 21, $7.7 billion in emergency rental assistance have been allocated to households, assisting approximately 2 million renters. Although spending has increased over the past several months, I think we're all concerned that the pace of delivery of this critical assistance is not happening quickly enough. Can you talk about the challenges you have faced after taking oversight of ERA-1 from the Trump administration? What do you believe are the most significant improvements to the program guidance you have made, and what impact have you seen?
Well, thank you for that question. This is a critically important program that Treasury has been very focused on expediting the delivery of these rental assistance funds to those who need it. As I mentioned in my opening statement, getting these funds out has involved creating a national infrastructure where none existed before. And that's been a very difficult and slow process. Treasury has done everything possible to facilitate getting these programs up and running around the country. In particular, we have tried to give states and localities flexibility to administer the program in ways that are appropriate for different communities, to reduce the paperwork requirements while also making sure that we have accountability and transparency. We've provided technical assistance and working to provide more technical assistance, and I do think we're seeing a payoff. As I mentioned, we've had 1.4 million renters helped by this assistance, and the pace at which it's flowing out is increasing. Also, I would note that the Act requires Treasury to begin to reallocate funds on September 30th from those localities that are either are not effective in getting assistance out or have less need for the funds, and to reallocate them to those that are more effective and have demonstrated need.
Well, thank you very much. And I want to thank you and your team for working with me on H.R. 5196, the Expediting Assistance to Renters and Landlords Act, which would make it easier for both renters and landlords to apply for assistance and provide for the deeper involvement of Treasury to support grantees to get the funds out the door. Are there particular provisions that you think would aid Treasury's efforts to make the rental assistance program more successful? You've given us quite a bit of information about what you have been involved with. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
Well, Chairwoman Waters, we're very supportive of your efforts to try to put in effect changes that would expedite the delivery and effectiveness of this program. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. I think we've offered substantial technical assistance and absolutely want to work with you to make sure this program is as effective as possible.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. McHenry, who is the ranking member of the committee, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Chairman Powell, I know it's the policy of the Federal Reserve to not comment on fiscal policy, but fiscal policy does impact the Fed's economic projection, does it not?
Yes, it does. We make assumptions about fiscal policy, and then once it's enacted, we would put that into our models.
Okay, but your public models are a statement about current law rather than proposed policy. Is that largely correct?
Well, when we don't really publish a forecast as the Federal Reserve. Individual participants publish their forecasts in the Summary of Economic Projections, but that would include their personal assessments of likely fiscal actions.
Okay. So about these fiscal actions. Secretary Yellen, I said this in my opening statement, and I'll say this to both of you again. I am grateful as an American that you both are in the seats that you're in right now, because we're in a special circumstance here in the fall of this year. It was a foreseeable, slow-moving disaster, but here we are. But your credibility of your relative agencies and the credibility of you two individuals is of substance right now and very important to us as an American government. So, Secretary Yellen, you said in July, right before the debt limit was reinstated, the CBO said Treasury would probably run out of cash sometime in the first quarter of next year, or the fiscal year, most likely in October or November. Secretary Yellen, you began exercising Treasury's authority to take extraordinary measures to prevent a default back in August. Is that correct?
Yes. The debt limit, this suspension expired on August 1st, and we began using extraordinary measures to remain under the debt ceiling.
But those extraordinary measures are just a Band-Aid for a period of time, right?
Well, as I indicated, we expect them to be exhausted on October 18th.
Okay. And it would be a disaster if we did not.
It would be a catastrophe if Congress failed to raise the debt ceiling.
So here's the deal for Republicans. Democrats control the House and the Senate and the White House. And since January 20th, the approach of this Congress is that they do not need Republican votes to do anything. That's been the approach. And now they want the political cover in the midst of this massive amount of new spending to have Republicans raise the debt ceiling. That's really the request. So here's my question to you, Secretary Yellen. For the seat you sit in, do you care whether or not the debt limit is raised with Republican votes, or do you just care if it's raised?
I think it's important that this be done on a bipartisan basis. I think it should be bipartisan in recognition of the fact that both Republican administrations and Congresses and Democratic ones have run budget deficits for most of the post-war period, with only a few years serving as an exception. And that requires, on a regular basis, raising the debt ceiling. It is not about, the need to do so has nothing to do with future spending or tax plans that haven't been enacted.
So in this circumstance,
it's necessary to pay our bills.
I understand,
and
Secretary Yellen.
That's something that Republicans and Democrats need to share that responsibility.
Secretary Yellen, as I said to you on the phone last week, I've been a part of every single debt ceiling increase for the last decade, every fiscal consequence of Congress, and some of them have been very bad, but I've tried to make things better. I've been a part of the solution for the last decade. And the call that I received from you last week was the first outreach I've had from this administration to do something on a bipartisan basis. And you called me to raise the debt ceiling. Not with a plan, not for a fiscal plan, not for my buy-in, but simply for my vote. And that, to me, speaks volumes. Now, I'm grateful for the outreach from you, but it speaks to the larger issue for the administration. And I don't envy the position you're in. I don't. Because the bad strategy from this White House and the leadership of this House and the Senate is showing they don't want Republican votes. We did bipartisan bills last Congress. And in the midst of COVID, bipartisan bills, major bipartisan bills. We can work together in a responsible manner, but to ask for my vote the week before it comes up in the House is not in keeping with the realities of the situation. Well, we have the tools, we have the votes to get this thing done through Congress. It's just a question of who votes for it.
I would like to point out that in 2017, when the White House and both houses of Congress were controlled by Republicans and a reconciliation bill was in progress that led to the 2017 tax cuts, the debt ceiling was raised, and it was done in a bipartisan basis.
In 11 and 13, I voted for a bill that President Obama signed. So I'm willing to participate in a bipartisan way. It's just a question of who votes for it in the circumstances of $7 trillion of new spending this year.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I got to just say initially, I'm kind of shocked at the ranking member, McHenry, saying that because he wasn't asked for a vote, something that's going to determine whether or not American people, Democrats and Republicans, will suffer if we don't raise this debt ceiling. And I've been here for 22 years, between whether it's Democratic or Republican administrations. And each time, when it came to the credit of the United States in our economy, it didn't make a difference to me whether or not the administration was Democratic or Republican, or whether or not someone called me to ask me for my vote. I'm here to try to do the best thing for the American people, not play politics. And when it comes to the credit for the United States and the economy moving on, it's not about who's the president or who called and asked me for a vote. It's about doing the right thing for the American people, Democrats and Republicans, and moving up this debt to making sure that we don't default on our debts is essential to that. And it's essential to our responsibility as members of Congress, and not to say, oh, nobody called me for a vote. That's simply not our responsibility. Now, Madam Secretary, there are consequences if we don't pass and increase the debt ceiling. I mean, like the increase in the cost of borrowing for a home or a car or through one's credit cards, of which folks will say on the other side, I don't have to deal with that, but then it's going to be, play politics with it. So I was wondering, as we are recovering from this economy, what setbacks will a default on debt cost American households, be they Democratic, Republican, independent, non-voters? What cost would it cost us?
Well, I think it would be catastrophic for the economy and for individual families. Nearly 50 million seniors could stop receiving Social Security payments or see them delayed. Our troops would not know when they would get their next paycheck. We have 30 million families who rely on the monthly child tax credit, and they would not receive that relief, at least on time. And as we saw in 2011, when the debt ceiling was raised at the absolute last minute, and investor and consumer confidence was shaken in the run-up, we saw a marked increase in interest rates, a marked drop in the stock market, and when U.S. interest rates go up and the credit rating of the United States was downgraded, that means higher interest payments for everyone who has a loan, whether it's a small business, a homeowner with a mortgage, a credit card payment. Anyone who borrows would see higher interest costs of their debt.
We must raise the debt ceiling for the benefit of the American people. I don't care what party they're from. Let me go to Chairman Powell. Now, the Fed is rightfully focused on controlling inflation while boosting employment with the aim of guiding our economy back to its pre-pandemic normal. And at the European Central Forum, you mentioned that it's urgent for the Fed to resolve the tension between these two policy goals, since taming prices by raising interest rates would weaken our labor market. As the Fed considers its monetary policy, how will
Tá
you manage
foda,
the
meu.
trade-offs
Puta que eu
between
pariu,
controlling
velho.
prices and ensuring full employment? And how do you plan to resolve the tension between the two that you spoke on Wednesday?
That's the very difficult situation we find ourselves in. Almost all of the time, inflation is low when unemployment is high, and so interest rates work on both problems now. So right now we're far away from, we think, away from full employment, so that gives us an incentive to keep accommodative policy strong, to keep accommodative policy in place. Inflation is well above target, and we have an expectation that high inflation will abate because we think the factors that are causing it are temporary and tied to the pandemic and the reopening of the economy. And what we say is we just have to balance the two, but I would say our expectation is that inflation will come down and we won't ultimately face that difficult trade-off of having the two goals in tension.
Thank you. The gentlewoman from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman. And Secretary Yellen, thank you for finally taking the time to appear before this committee. I know that the ranking member has formally requested your presence at least twice within the last few months with no response. Last week, Treasury released the latest data on its emergency rental assistance programs. As you know, $46 billion was made available to supposedly help COVID-impacted low-income families pay off their back rent and to help make mom-and-pop property owners whole in Missouri's 2nd Congressional District and beyond. After more than 9 months and an entire summer of Republicans pushing Treasury, your own data still shows more than 83% of your funds remain unspent, while millions of renters and property owners remain stuck in limbo. It certainly doesn't sound, ma'am, like it has been in your words, expedited program. Now, I have a series of yes and no questions. And because my time is limited, I would appreciate and will insist upon a simple yes or no, ma'am. First, Madam Secretary, do you consider Treasury's Emergency Rental Assistance Program to be a success? Yes or no?
Yes.
Amazing. Are you aware that in December of 2020, when Congress appropriated the first $25 billion for Emergency Rental Assistance Program, funds were to be used by December of 2021? Yes or no?
Yes.
Do you know why Congress set that initial deadline?
Make sure that funds get to those who are in need.
To get it out the door to renters and landlords ASAP. Madam Secretary, are you aware that just this past March, Democrats extended the time frame for Emergency Rental Assistance Program to the years 2022 and, are you ready for this, 2025 for the two respective programs? Yes or no?
Yes, there's significant need, and it will continue.
In
and
2025, ma'am, I continue. Does extending the program's deadline incentivize grantees to get funds out by extending this? Does it incentivize grantees to get funds out the door, yes or no?
We're doing everything we can, and the states and localities
it's not fast
are
enough.
to get it out the door. As I indicated in my opening statement, where in response to a previous question, the infrastructure to do this had to be built, and the pace at which
there was
money is
plenty of
getting out
time
the
for
door
the infrastructure
is
to be
increasing.
set. Our Fed programs, our PPP programs, all of those expeditiously got money to people who needed them. This is a complete and abject failure.
I'm sorry,
Secretary Yellen,
this was...
I want to read a quote to you from a Treasury official to journalists on September 24th, and I quote, "To simply take the amount of money that has gone out in the first 5 or 6 months and then compare that to what was allocated for 4 or 5 years is just a meaningless number." Meaningless number. Secretary Yellen is getting money out the door as soon as possible. A meaningless gauge, particularly when we are talking about a pandemic-related eviction crisis, yes or no?
Our objective is to get the money out.
Well, it hasn't gotten out the door. 83% of it is still sitting in the Treasury coffers.
1.4 million.
Ma'am, because my constituents in St. Louis and I do not find it meaningless when we are talking about emergency assistance meant to keep individuals and families in their homes today during a pandemic, not years and years later out to 2025. Moving on. Chairman Powell, with spiking energy prices and bottlenecks in supply chains around the world, there are concerns that there is a rise in inflation may not be as transitory as you originally predicted. Given our current economic situation and the fact that Democrats want to pass trillions and trillions more in spending, what makes you believe we will not see more sustained higher inflation, especially when we've seen significant consumer price increases, et cetera, et cetera?
So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we do think that inflation will remain elevated before these supply side bottlenecks are resolved, and we think that it will then move back down toward our goal.
Time frame?
Well, these are not things that we control. We don't control.
Not very transitory, sir. It seems pretty dug in.
I would say that this is a function of supply side bottlenecks over which we have no control. But I would say that we do expect in the first half of next year to see some relief, depending on the bottleneck in question, and inflation should move down over the course of.
Not a time to be spending trillions and trillions of dollars. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez, who is also the chair of the House Committee on Small Business, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Secretary Yellen, I would like to pick up with what Chair Waters was.
Ms. Velasquez, we can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
You seem to be unmuted, but the sound is not coming through very well.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
No, we can't hear you. Would you try it again, please?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Chairwoman. Secretary Yellen, I would like to pick up with what Chair Waters was asking on Iraq. Can you please explain the type of resistance the Treasury Department continues to face from some state and local governments? How is the Treasury Department trying to expedite this funding to tenants and landlords who need it the most despite these challenges?
Well, in cases where states and other grantees launch their programs late, they faced an array of complications. The most significant involved obtaining the necessary authorizations from a grantee's governing body, and there were procurement challenges that arise when grantees have to engage outside partners and contractors. We've received a lot of feedback indicating that the guidance that Treasury has released really does give state and local programs the tools they need to move forward expeditiously. And I'd also note that we have been partnering with HUD to send out technical experts who can help grantees accelerate their programs and help them document best practices.
Thank you. So early on, New York was one of the lowest performing states in distributing ERA funding. But significant progress has been made, and the state now ranks first nationally with more than $1.2 billion in payments made or obligated. Unfortunately, more assistance is needed. So the Treasury Department is required to start reallocating excess first-round funds at the end of September. Can you tell us how this process will unfold?
Well, thank you for that question. Our objective will be to maximize the number of eligible households that are served by ensuring that the resources of the program are appropriately aligned with each grantee's needs and ability to deliver reassistance. And reallocation will be really critical in achieving that objective. Our framework, we will identify localities that have excess funds. We'll use clear expenditure benchmarks that increase over time. We will strive to keep reallocated funds within the same state when it's possible and afford a venue for voluntary reallocation among grantees.
Thank you. Thank you. Under the American Rescue Plan, Secretary Yellen, Democrats reauthorized the state Small Business Credit Initiative, providing $10 billion in federal funds to support up to $100 billion in new loans and initiatives for small businesses through state, territory, tribal, and local governments. Under the program, potential grantees must submit a completed application by February. How is the Treasury Department conducting outreach and working with local governments to ensure completed applications are submitted on a timely basis?
Well, thank you. This is a very important program. Our staff have contacted each state individually to follow up on the application notice, see if there are questions or if help is needed. We've set up webinars. We're assisting in program design, in helping to develop programs, and with respect to tribal governments, we've been conducting extensive outreach.
Thank you. And Chair Powell, would you agree with what Secretary Yellen is saying regarding raising the debt limit, the debt ceiling?
Yes, I think it's essential the debt ceiling be raised in a timely fashion so we can pay our bills, and I think the consequences of that failure to do so would be potentially severe.
Thank you. Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Yellen, do you believe that President Biden's reconciliation package proposal, the one with the $3.5 trillion in total spending, will cost zero and be fully paid for?
Yes, I do. We have a full program that the president has proposed to raise revenue that would cover the costs of the program. In the president's budget, of course, there are changes under consideration as this goes through Congress, but there are a host of revenue raisers, and I do believe it will be actually deficit reducing beyond the first 10 years of the program.
Okay, thank you. I mean, yesterday, Speaker Pelosi claimed the same thing, that the Democrats' reconciliation proposal would cost zero, that it would be paid for. President Biden said the same thing in a tweet earlier. So call me skeptical, but given the record of the Democrats in Congress here on runaway spending, I just don't believe it. And I'm not the only one. The Washington Post called President Biden's claim that the bill would be budget neutral misleading and gave it a score of 2 Pinocchios. We're passing bills out of committee, I understand, without even CBO scores, Congressional Budget Office scores, so we don't really know, and that we've not done that before. That's a change in our policy. The truth is we're spending an alarming rate in this country. Since the COVID-19 pandemic began last year, the federal government has spent more than $5.3 trillion on relief. That's roughly $16,000 for every American. Our ballooning debt is not some abstract problem. Out of control spending proposed by Biden and being rubber stamped here in Congress will leave a mess that our children and grandchildren have to clean up and pay for. There's decisions we make today, 20 or 30 years from now, our children and grandchildren have to pay this money back. So I'd like to move to a different aspect of the package. One of the attempted pay-fors in the package that's alarming to me is tax increases. It will make our economy less competitive. So again, to Secretary Yellen, my question is, the proposed corporate tax rate in the House reconciliation bill is 26.5%. This actually moves us higher than communist China's corporate tax rate of 25%. We're going to have a higher tax rate than a country that has been taking our jobs and is communist ideology. Can you explain why raising our corporate tax rate above China's is a good idea, if you think it is? And do you think this would hurt our competitiveness with China and around the world?
Our companies are the most competitive and profitable in the world. The effective tax rate that they pay is very low, and recent studies suggest that among advanced countries, the United States has an effective tax rate that is among the lowest of countries around the world. We can certainly afford to take the corporate tax rate up to 26.5% as in House Ways and Means without negatively impacting firms' performance. And we propose to do that in the context of an international agreement that received the support of over 130 countries worldwide to establish global minimum tax rates that will apply to other countries' firms. Right now, the United States is the only country with a global minimum tax rate on its multinational corporations. We propose to raise that, but at the same time, other countries will raise theirs much more. And that means that the competitiveness of American firms will be enhanced, and we will be reducing the incentives that exist in our tax law right now to export jobs and profits.
Thank you. I don't know how much time I have left, but thank you, Secretary Yellen. Well, one thing we've learned over the last several years is we need to take the threat from China more seriously here in America, making America less competitive. And despite what you said, raising our corporate tax rate makes us less competitive. And our economic adversaries like China, it's too high of a cost for all this spending. Running up these massive debts that our children will have to pay back for this spending is just not right. So despite what we're hearing and what many are saying, this reconciliation package will be expensive in terms of dollars and frankly to the future of our competitiveness in this country, racking up this debt, and I just fear we're going to pay for this for years to come. So thank you, Madam Chair. Back to balance.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman from Ohio, Mrs. Beatty, who is also the chair of the Subcommittee on Diversity and Inclusion, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today. Certainly, as I've been listening, a lot of descriptive words were used, everything from dysfunctional to meaningless to irrational. Well, I could think of a lot of other words that I could use, but certainly those words are appropriate to describe what Democrats inherited from the last administration, whether that's the irresponsibleness of the past administration, whether it's all the debt that was occurred because of the Trump administration. I think those words are appropriate, just, Madam Chair, by my colleagues, were very misdirected, in my opinion. You should look at your own house and home before throwing stones, and especially when they're not appropriate. Now, with that said, to our two witnesses who've been very responsive, I say thank you. And let me get in quickly to my first question on the Federal Reserve. Certainly, you know, Mr. Chair, we've had a lot of conversations about diversity. I want to thank you for responding and continuing to increase your diversity. But as you know, recently there's been two Federal Reserve presidents who have left, quit, retired, bottom line, immediately leaving or gone from the Bank of Dallas and Boston. So my question is, you know where I'm going with this. I would certainly be hopeful that we could increase our numbers in diversity beyond Raphael Bostic by asking that we use the Beatty rule, pattern after the Rooney rule, to do as we did with the Atlanta Federal Reserve president and make sure in that interview process we have a African American or female. Do you have any comments on that?
I do. Thank you, Ms. Beatty. I can absolutely guarantee you that we will work hard in both of those processes to find and give a fair shot to diverse candidates for those two jobs as we do. And it'll be a big focus of both of those processes.
Thank you. Secretary Yellen, you will recall back in 2016, Secretary Lew made his historic announcement that Harriet Tubman would be the face on a $20 bill. I sent you a letter in July, early July, along with my colleague, Congressman Katko, requesting the committee to move forward with the Obama administration's plan to put her on the face of the 20. I understand your staffs have been in discussion on this issue, and am hoping to get a high-level overview and to ask you if there's any comment you can make on this.
Well, thank you for that question, Representative Beatty. We believe it is very important that our notes reflect the history and diversity of our country, and I couldn't possibly think of a better way to honor Harriet Tubman's legacy and her courage in fighting for the freedom of enslaved people and women's right to vote than seeing her on the $20 bill. Issuing notes, as you know, is a very lengthy process. It involves collaboration among a number of different agencies, and it's necessary to design new security and counterfeit features. And unfortunately, that means the lead time to redesign new bills and ensure their security is long. when Secretary
I'm
Liu
gonna
announced
go to my rental. Madam Secretary, I'm gonna go to my rental question because the clock is down, and we will follow up with your staff. Just prior to the new administration coming into office, the former administration rushed the regulations and questions for the rental assistance program. Those regulations were so unworkable that states like my state, Ohio, and others were telling me that they weren't even sure if they would be able to distribute rental assistance funds under those guidelines. Isn't it true that, Secretary Yellen, isn't it true that the Secretary under the new administration had to spend weeks going back and redoing all of that to make sure that the funds could actually be distributed?
That's correct.
Thank you. I want that to go on the record. Some of my colleagues wanted to drill down and make our Secretary you in answering those questions. So thank you.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I thank our witnesses and our colleagues. I appreciate this hearing. Chairman Powell, you have extensive private sector experience, and of course, as Chairman of the Federal Reserve, you have a role in bank regulation. In your experience, do banks or lenders increase lines of credit unconditionally? Isn't there some level of underwriting involved? Wouldn't banks have problems with their regulators if they did no underwriting for a line of credit?
Yes, no, of course, they're very careful in the lending they do.
Well, I submit that it's perfectly rational for Congress to expect something in exchange for an increased line of credit. The plan presented is atrocious. It will never balance. It doesn't even propose to balance in 15, 20, 30, 100 years. There's no plan to quit bankrupting America, Madam Secretary. Now, thankfully, under the Federal Reserve's leadership and 13.3 authority, we had some facilities in place to prevent real financial calamity. So recently, the Subcommittee on National Security, International Development, and Monetary Policy held a hearing to discuss the Federal Reserve's lending facilities under Section 13.3 and how those facilities were utilized prior to and since the passage of the CARES Act. Some of my colleagues, I fear, don't understand even how some of the products like bonds or margin calls work, as they've criticized programs where there is literally no buy side in the market. And of course, the Federal Reserve stepped in to create a buy side and support the markets. I've heard colleagues say, well, there were only 2 loans under the municipal liquidity facility, for example, while there were hundreds of loans, hundreds of billions of dollars of credit extended. How important are the 13.3 provisions to the financial stability of our country?
They're very important, but they're reserved for real economic emergencies, financial emergencies. And as you point out, they functioned, I think, very well in the crisis as backstops. That we put them in place and the private capital markets started working. And really, that's success. That's what success looks like.
Do you think 13.3 should ever be used for a political goal or something to fulfill a dual mandate rather than an emergency?
Actually, no, I don't. I think the current institutional arrangements are very good. I think we need the approval of the Treasury Secretary. Realistically, we work with Treasury, and we're constrained for very specific circumstances, unusual and exigent circumstances. There are a number of tests in the law, and I think it's an arrangement that works.
Thank you, Chairman. Recently, Federal Reserve Governor Michelle Bowman gave a speech in which she discussed the evolution and enhancement of bank supervision, particularly during the COVID pandemic. And in that speech, she stated that the Fed avoided overreacting and instead approached supervision in a more measured way that allowed banks the flexibility to work with their customers. There are a range of topics she's addressed and others have with bank regulation. I'll just share this from her paper. She says, the goal of this initiative is to ensure our supervisory approaches accommodate a much broader range of activities while ensuring we don't create an unlevel playing field with unfair advantages or unfair disadvantages.
Bom, galera, deixa eu falar com vocês rapidão aí, porque eu vou ter que sair aqui, então vou puxar minha câmera aqui, que é essa aqui, não, essa aqui, rapidão. Olha só, pessoal, a gente conseguiu fazer aí boas operações, né? Vocês viram eu tentando venda, tá acreditando em venda, tentando venda. Eu acho que a ideia é essa mesmo. Quando você está acreditando num cenário, desde que o mercado esteja te mostrando aquele cenário, eu acompanho, né? Teve dias que o mercado estava mostrando venda, eu querendo compra e o mercado mostrando venda. Isso não dá para fazer. Então, valeu demais. Eu vou mostrar já já minhas operações, né? Só o saldo ali. Eu acho que alguns já viram, mas eu vou mostrar. Vou deixar rolando a entrevista até o final, tá? Mas eu não vou poder ficar aqui. Então, valeu demais você que compareceu aí, cara. Obrigado. Cara, se inscreve no canal aí, velho. Se inscreve no canal, ativa o sininho, dá like, compartilha aquela coisa toda que as blogueirinhas falam, porque eu sou dessas, falo também, ajuda o canal a crescer, e aí a gente consegue trazer mais conteúdo de qualidade para vocês. Mas valeu demais. Eu vou dar meu tchau especial aí para cada um de vocês, mostro as minhas operações aqui, e aí vou deixar a live rolando até finalizar aqui essa entrevista lá no Senado, porque na verdade lá no Senado só choveu no molhado, né? Os caras lá interpelando, por que você não fez isso, por que você fez aquilo, não sei o que, não sei o que, o cara falando, não, olha, tem dado aqui, tem dado disso ali, não sei o que lá. Choveu no molhado, não vai mudar nada, tanto que o mercado foi para o lado que ele estava indo ainda, né? Nem deu grandes movimentações, se bem que o Dow foi lá no alvo, cara, lá no fiofó da mosca, né, velho? Foi super, super show de bola, então é isso, tá? Então eu vou dar meu tchau aí e depois a gente se fala mais. Ó, o Éder já foi, valeu, Éder. Deixa eu minimizar minha câmera aqui, deixa eu abrir aqui. Então, valeu Afonso Rocha, Éder Pereira, Douglas S, valeu, galera, até mais. Valeu, Rafael Mesquita, valeu, Rafael, valeu. Rafael, sou Rafael. Quem mais estava aí? O Edson já falei. Valeu, Felipe Ruxi. Até mais, irmão. Obrigado por vocês estarem aí. Eduardo Rodrigo já foi. Valeu. Valeu, quem mais? Valeu, Leonardo Silva. Até mais. Tamo junto. Até amanhã. Valeu, Felipe Ribeiro. É nóis, irmão. E é isso aí, pessoal. Amanhã estaremos juntos novamente, tá? Deixa eu só mostrar aqui as operações que eu fiz, né? Tentei 5 operações dentro do meu plano de trade. Então, a primeira operação deu 5,5, a segunda deu 7, a terceira operação deu 28,5 e a última operação, que foi a boa, deu 61,5. Daí $100 aqui. Acho que deve dar uns 100, né? Quase lá. 60, 60, 88. 88, 89, né? 89, 90, 90, 97, 102, 107. Beleza? Então 107 doletas hoje. Valeu, pessoal. Então vou deixar o microfone desligado. Vamos fazer o esquema das blogueirinhas aí. E amanhã a gente continua a partir das 10 horas. É isso aí, pessoal. Valeu. Tchau.
Analysis at this point is about institutions really understanding what these risks will be, how they will develop over time, what are the channels through which they will develop, and it's sort of early days in understanding how those risks will interact with the economy and with the financial system. Scenario analysis is meant to help do that, and we at the Fed are working on developing a program of scenario analysis. Many of the large institutions are doing so, as I mentioned, quite different from stress tests, which have consequences for distributions and that kind of thing. I think overall, we see our job, as I mentioned, as making sure that these financial institutions understand the risks and can manage them, and that's just a lot of basic supervisory tools, understanding what they're doing, and have the processes in place and the analytical tools in place and the focus, and that's what we'll be doing.
Okay, thank you. Secretary Yellen, I am concerned that small business, particularly within the communities of color, will have lasting economic damage coming out of this pandemic. The American Rescue Plan extended assistance to small business by authorizing a $10 billion program called the State Small Business Credit Initiative, with $2.5 billion of these funds set aside for minority-owned business. The Florida Department of Economic Opportunity is waiting for the Treasury to release applications, requirements, and program guidance. When can we expect the guidance to be released? And can we share our treasurer plan to ensure that the assistance goes to small business that will be highly impacted by the pandemic?
It's the state's small business credit initiative is an extremely important program, and we're in the process of implementing it. We will absolutely make sure that it reaches small businesses that have been very severely affected by the pandemic, and certainly in underserved areas and communities of color. I think you know that Congress required that Treasury provide funds to states based on the extent of job losses that had been suffered, and it sets aside significant funds for businesses that are owned by socially and economically disadvantaged individuals. So we will make this funding available and provide technical assistance, working with communities to make sure that it's used as intended.
Okay, thank you very much, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Budd, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairwoman and thank the witnesses. You know, the federal government's spending, and I'm not even talking about debt, but just the spending here, it's expected to reach record highs this year, 2021, and Democrats are trying to dump trillions of what I believe is very reckless spending into an already inflationary economy. So as a percentage of GDP, our public debt has reached 125% in the second quarter. Secretary Yellen, very briefly, do you believe that there is a level of debt that is unsustainable in our economy? And if so, what is that number? And you can share that with me either in dollars or as a percentage of GDP.
Well, I believe that the debt held by the public relative to GDP is around 105%. And that's a number that is higher than we've had during most of the post-war period in the United States, but it is not a number that I think is fiscally irresponsible or unsustainable. Interest
Madam Secretary, do you have a number that is the threshold that is irresponsible, either in percentage or in dollars?
Well, one way that I would judge that is by looking at the interest burden, the real interest burden on the debt. That really is the burden, a better measure of the burden it places on our economy. And this year, that interest burden has actually been negative. Interest rates have been exceptionally low. This dates back to before the financial crisis in 2008, and most economists believe that there are deep structural reasons why low interest rates are likely to continue, even if nominal interest rates move back toward more normal levels. That interest burden.
Just because I want to be aware of the time constraints, thank you, Ms. Secretary. If the interest rate was zero, what is irresponsible in percentage or dollars?
Well, I think that if the real interest burden stays below
if it's as
historical
is,
norms. I'm sorry, if interest rates are zero?
If it's, let's say zero, let's say as is, pick one of those, and let's say what is irresponsible as a percentage or total dollars of debt?
Well, if interest rates are zero and negative in real terms, certainly we could have a substantially higher burden, although there are always risks pertaining to the path of interest rates that need to be taken account of.
I understand. Thank you. Let me shift gears a bit. In one of my recent telephone town halls, I asked a poll question to those who were able to join me. It said, have you or your family noticed a sharp rise in prices for food, gas, or electricity? And 94% of the respondents, and it was a good sample size, they said yes. Inflation is eating away at the buying power of every single North Carolinian. And bottom line, inflation is a tax on working Americans. So Chairman Powell, I know that you've called the inflation that we're dealing with transitory, and boy, I sure hope you're right. But what would you tell people back in my district, especially those on fixed incomes, when they are struggling to make ends meet right now? What would you tell them?
I would say that we are dealing with a very unusual event that's really part of the broader COVID event, that the economy is now reopening, that we're hitting supply-side bottlenecks. For example, it's hard to manufacture cars without semiconductors, which are in short supply, so car prices are going up, and lots of prices are being affected by supply-side constrictions. We expect that those will abate, that they'll lessen, and over time inflation will come back down. Exactly when that will happen is not possible to say, but I would say we should be seeing some relief in coming months and over the course of the first half of next year.
I hope you're right. The folks I talked to back in North Carolina are doubtful of that, but I do hope you're right. Chairman Powell, next question. So in a July hearing before this committee, you were asked about CBDC, or the central bank digital currencies, and their impact on stablecoin and other cryptocurrencies. And you stated, and I think I quote you correctly here, you wouldn't need stablecoins, you wouldn't need cryptocurrencies if you had a digital U.S. currency. So, Mr. Chairman, as a matter of policy, is it your intention to ban or limit the use of cryptocurrencies like we're seeing in China?
No, and I immediately realized I had misspoken there. I didn't mean that take the word cryptocurrency out of that sentence, and I would say it's fairly widely understood that central bank digital currencies could perform could make.
But no intention to ban.
Less.
No intention to ban.
No intention to ban them, but they're, the stable coins are like money market funds, they're like bank deposits, but they're to some extent outside the regulatory perimeter, and it's appropriate that they be regulated. Same activity, same regulation.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Caston, who is also the Vice Chair of the Subcommittee on Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you so much to our witnesses. We are truly fortunate to have you at the helm of steering us through some past and future crises. I want to talk about those, but before that, I want to just talk about manufactured crises, which I'd like to avoid. Congress, everybody on this call in some fashion has voted to approve our spending. Congress, everybody on this call in some fashion has voted to decide how much of that spending will be paid with tax revenues. And then somewhat uniquely, we give ourselves the authority to decide how much of the residual, which is paid with debt, we are going to pay for. It's political suicide. I am a co-sponsor and supporter of my friend, Mr. Foster's bill, H.R. 3305, to end the Default Act and take that tool away from Congress, because Congress has proven that we cannot be trusted with that responsibility. Secretary Yellen, without getting into the specifics of Mr. Foster's bill, would you support simply eliminating the debt ceiling so that we don't have to deal with this in the future and can focus on real crises?
Yes, I would, because I believe when Congress legislates expenditures and puts in place tax policy that determines taxes, those are the crucial decisions Congress is making. And if to finance those spending and tax decisions, it's necessary to issue additional debt, I believe it's very destructive to put the President and myself, the Treasury Secretary, in a situation where we might be unable to pay the bills that result from those past decisions.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear it, and we'll hopefully try to get that through Congress. Moving on to past crises, Chair Powell, I think all of us in all of our districts are hearing about labor market tightness, and I think a lot of people are explaining that labor market tightness to justify pre-existing political biases. As you know, and we've talked about, we saw unemployment go from 3.5% to almost 10% and back down to 5.2%, but I'm much more concerned that workforce participation went from 63 to 61 and has stayed low. Can you just explain for the committee briefly what is driving the reduction in workforce participation, and what, if anything, we can do to get that number back up to make sure that employers have access to folks who are ready and able to work?
I'd be glad to. So the two biggest parts of that are caretakers and retirees. So that makes up a lot of the shortfall from where we were with labor force participation before the pandemic crisis. And within caretakers, Some of that is going to be connected to schools not being opened or people who are afraid to go into an unvaccinated workplace and are afraid of COVID and things like that, and other reasons. So that's a part of that, and that should abate over time. In terms of the retiree piece, it's not clear about that. I would say the lore is that people don't come out of retirement, except I would say all during the last few years of the very long expansion that ended with the pandemic, we were constantly surprised to the upside on participation, including older people staying in the workforce longer. So I think my prior would be that we will get back a big chunk of the so-called retirees, and that we should be very open-minded about how much labor force participation can go up. The United States has low labor force participation compared to our advanced economy peers, and this is not something that has to be that way. It's not something that's good.
Well, thank you for that. Certainly, when I talk to folks in the district, everybody kind of acknowledges that it's the boomers who retired who are creating a lot of their skills gap, and that's a harder challenge. Going back to you, Secretary Yellen, I think subsequent to your first FSOC hearing, when you identified climate change as an emerging threat, President Biden issued an emergency order on climate financial risk, directing agencies, including yours, to analyze and mitigate risks that climate change poses to the financial system. In the little time we've got left, can you give us any updates on status, milestones, and deliverables that the Treasury Department has in response to that executive order?
Yes, we're in the process of completing the report, and we expect to issue it in late October or early November within the 180-day time frame. And what we'll be doing is looking at the work of individual regulators to incorporate climate change risks into their regulatory and supervisory activities, and describing some of the challenges that they face in carrying that out.
Well, thank you. I'm out of town. I will clear my calendar to allow some time to read that week, and I yield back to the chair.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Kustoff, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for calling today's hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for appearing. Secretary Yellen, if I could, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal dated September 15th. The headline is, Yellen, IRS pushed Democrats to require banks to report taxpayer annual account flows. And I want to read the first two paragraphs just briefly. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and IRS Commissioner Charles Reddick pressed lawmakers Wednesday to give the Internal Revenue Service more information about taxpayer bank accounts as the Biden administration tries to salvage its struggling tax compliance proposal. In letters to lawmakers, the administration officials again asked Congress to require banks to report annual inflows and outflows from bank accounts with at least $600 or at least $600 worth of transactions, a proposal aimed at letting the IRS target its audits more effectively. It would generate about $460 billion over a decade to cover the cost of Democrats' planned expansion of the social safety net and climate change policies, according to the administration. Those are the first two paragraphs of the story. That's an accurate reflection of what you've done, correct?
Yes, we have proposed both augmenting the resources of the IRS so that it can hire qualified auditors, and augmenting the information flow so that the IRS gets insight into opaque sources of income, and both together, we believe, can serve to greatly address the $7 trillion estimated tax gap that we'll see in this country.
And Madam Secretary, you would tell my constituents that they should not have any privacy concerns about what you're trying to do.
Well, they should not, because this is a simple matter for banks that already file 1099 int forms
Madam
with the
Secretary,
IRS.
the IRS leaked information about taxpayers to ProPublica that was published, their entire tax returns, their entire tax information. On the record, you tell my constituents and all the other members here, their constituents, that they should have no privacy concerns about banks reporting $600 or more in account value to the IRS.
What we've asked to have reported is the aggregate inflows and outflows from these accounts each year on an annual basis, 2 additional pieces of information, not transaction level data. And look, every wage earner in this country
This
has
says bank
wage
accounts of
income.
at least $600. Is that a correct statement?
Well, we want to make sure that this can't
That's
be
different from
gained by
transactions.
expanding.
Those are values of $600.
There's
The Wall Street Journal is accurate, correct?
Excuse me?
The Wall Street Journal's report is accurate, correct?
We did propose that. I don't believe it's an invasion of privacy. And look, the IRS gets a great deal of information that it needs in order to make sure that taxpayers comply with the tax code. It receives individual information on wages and salaries that are received, on dividends, on transactions, on...
How did ProPublica receive this information from the IRS about the individual taxpayers?
Excuse me?
How did ProPublica publish and obtain the information from your agent, from the IRS, about taxpayer information?
Independent agencies and law enforcement are currently looking into that and attempting to figure out how that occurred. That is clearly a crime and an utterly unacceptable thing, and it will be prosecuted when it's understood. When these
your
agencies
proposal purports to give more information to the IRS, drilling down to accounts of $600.
We want to make sure that individuals can't game the system by opening multiple accounts in order to evade the...
And that you give the IRS all this other information about individuals. Last question, Madam Secretary. Do you support a move to the Department of Treasury from Homeland Security of the United States Secret Service?
I haven't taken a view on that.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from New York, Mr. Torres, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm appalled by the Republican gamesmanship around the debt limit. I heard a Republican colleague on this committee complain about not receiving a phone call from the administration or complain that we, the Democrats, are too partisan. The Republican argument seems to be the following, that since the Democrats have been mean to us, we are going to sabotage the full faith and credit of the United States to exact revenge against those who have slighted us. And that kind of pettiness has me wondering, are we in high school or the United States Congress? Now, it has to be said that the debt limit, raising the debt limit, would not authorize new spending. It would simply pay the debts of previous administrations, including the Trump administration. So the Republicans cannot pass $2 trillion worth of tax cuts and then refuse to pay back the debt that made those tax cuts possible in the first place. That, to me, is worse than fiscal responsibility. That's fiscal hypocrisy, and I support Congressman Foster's legislation abolishing the debt limit so that we're no longer at the whims of bruised egos slighted by unreturned phone calls. Suppose for a moment it is October 18th. The use of extraordinary measures is exhausted. What happens on October 19th?
We're simply in an impossible situation in which it will be impossible for Treasury on that day or a few days thereafter, depending on we'll have very limited resources that will be run down quickly. We won't be able to pay all of the government's bills. The Treasury has been directed by Congress to pay all of the government's bills, to use the tax revenues that are available, and without that to issue debt, and the debt ceiling will make it impossible for us to do that.
And the damage could be irreparable.
Well, yes, and we got a taste of that in 2011 when the debt ceiling wasn't raised until the last minute. The fact that Congress might not raise the debt limit and call into question whether or not what is regarded as the safest asset in the world, dollar-denominated U.S. Treasury debt, will actually be repaid, is simply a catastrophic event.
I want to follow up on an exchange you had with Congressman Budd, who asked you about the debt to GDP ratio. The U.S. debt to GDP ratio is over 100%. What is Japan's debt to GDP ratio?
Excuse me?
What is Japan's debt to GDP ratio?
It's about 250%.
It's the highest in the world.
Yes, it is.
And Japan is regarded as a successful economy.
It is, and Japan also has low interest rates and has not found.
And I agree with your premise that the cost of servicing debt is a more reliable measure of debt sustainability than the debt to GDP ratio. And if we were to breach the debt limit, as Republicans would have us do, it would actually raise the cost of borrowing. It would raise interest rate payments, which would make our debt burden less sustainable, not more.
That is absolutely correct. You know, it would be regarded as riskier. We might suffer, again, a credit downgrade, and coming out of that, we could expect to see higher interest rates on Treasury debt and on the debt that private individuals have, mortgage debt, credit card debt, auto loans, and everything else.
I want to quickly ask you about a Title IV loan under the CARES Act. During the Trump administration, the largest recipient of the Title IV national security loan was a trucking company, previously known as YRC Worldwide and presently known as Yellow Corporation. Do you think a nearly bankrupt trading company whose conduct is the subject of a DOJ lawsuit for overcharging should have received the national security loan from the Trump administration?
I'm afraid I don't know the details of that, and I'd be glad to have our staff get back to you on that.
And I want to be clear that this loan is the subject of scrutiny from the Bipartisan Congressional Oversight Commission and the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus. You said that at the end of September, the funding for the emergency rental assistance might be reallocated. Up to how much funding might be reallocated?
I can't give you a dollar estimate, but the objective would be to shift it to areas where there's need and proven success in getting it out.
And if the use of extraordinary measures is exhausted on October 18th, what does the Federal Reserve do on October 19th? What actions do you take in response, if any? And that'll be my final question.
I guess I would just say no one should assume that we can really do much to if there were to be a default on our obligations, no one should assume that the Fed or anyone else can fully shield the American people from the consequences of that.
My time has expired, so.
The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Hollingsworth, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning. I'm going to ask most of my questions to Secretary Yellen. First and foremost, I want to associate myself with the comments that Mr. Kustoff made. I love serving on this committee. I have a great time working on the policies that emanate from this committee, but rarely does something that this committee do lead to questions in the grocery store, questions at convenience stores, and questions around my district. But I have to tell you, the proposal that has been put forth about expanding the amount of information that the IRS is going to get on private bank accounts has been something I've been asked about at parks, at grocery stores, at convenience stores around the district. This has people deeply afraid about the emergence of an apparatus that can be used against them. So I want to better understand with specificity what is being proposed, because what I saw in the proposal as circulated by Treasury was extremely generic and somewhat incongruent with what I heard today. You said to Mr. Kustoff that the only things that will be reported to the IRS under your proposal is the gross inflow and the gross outflow from that particular account in a given year. Is that accurate or inaccurate in what you have requested?
The proposal put forward by the administration requested a bit more information than that, but what is under consideration now in reconciliation would be limited to those two pieces of information. And this would be what you should tell people who ask you about this in the park is that right now, much of the audit time of the IRS is devoted to taxpayers that have relatively low incomes. And we know that the tax gap is something that comes from opaque sources of income and from high-income individuals.
So I need to tell my
The audit rates on individuals earning less than $400,000 would not increase. This would
Wait a minute.
Audits
They're not worried about the
to
audit
those-
rates, reclaiming my time. They're not worried about the audit rates. They're worried about yielding their privacy, yielding their transaction history to a federal government, reclaiming my time, to a federal government that has shown itself time and time again, mobilizing that information against individuals, against organizations, and against businesses, has shown itself incapable of protecting that data from breaches by nation states, from breaches, reclaiming my time. This is deeply concerning to them. So forgive me if I won't go back to them and say, don't worry, despite all evidence to the contrary about their past history, the federal government really means it this time when they say they're going to respect your privacy, when they intend to build firewalls around this enormous database of personal information to them. And, by the way, which you brought up, we're doing it for a really good purpose. We're doing it for a really good purpose. Forgive them if they don't believe that the government is showing up on their doorstep to ask about the inflows and outflows from their personal accounts at a very de minimis level, and that is going to be used for only their good purpose.
There is no transaction level data being that would be reported to the IRS.
Can you clarify what you mean by a bit more data then? When you said, I asked, is it just these two things? And you said, it's a bit more. What does a bit more mean?
The proposal by the administration that was originally put forward requested some additional information, particularly about businesses and partnerships.
Yeah.
But there is no transaction level data for individuals being considered by this Congress.
I want to point out.
Look, why is it okay that we have businesses report wage and salary income, or companies report dividends?
I think reclaiming my time, I think there's some real concern about growing the amount of data that the federal government has proven itself incapable of handling correctly, or at some point ethically, to the IRS. I heard testimony 2 years ago about how China was able to apprehend many of the protesters in Hong Kong. The way that they did that was mining financial data, not by virtue of great law enforcement work and investigatory work, but instead by mining financial data about who was scanning their credit card in order to buy subway tickets to those particular locations. This worries Americans who are rightly concerned about a federal government that does not have their best interest at heart, but is telling them that for the greater good, they need to yield more privacy, more of their privacy, more of the things that they do in their personal accounts, because we might be able to close the tax gap for other people who are cheating. With that, I'll yield my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Axney, who is also the vice chair of the subcommittee on housing, community, and development and insurance, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Secretary Yellen and Chair Powell, for being here. It's great to see you. Listen, we've heard a lot about inflation, of course, but I want to dig a little bit into this. Chair Powell, you recently mentioned that price increases are relatively concentrated in particular areas. And yes, I think most folks can understand that things like airlines and hotels, et cetera, industries that took a hit during COVID, because people weren't really traveling, this could be an issue there. However, I want to get into some other areas where we've seen price increases. One of the biggest areas is in cars, both new and used. And I wanted to touch base about this. Secretary Yellen, one of the key causes of the shortages and the prices of the increase in our cars is because of shortages of semiconductors and production issues. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. There have been significant semiconductor shortages, particularly affecting cars.
Thank you. And I hear regularly from businesses in my district about supply chain issues coming off of the pandemic. that are unfortunately holding back our companies. One recently told me that their sales are down $120 million, really because they're producing to supply chain. So, Chair Powell, we see that elsewhere too, with ships waiting offshore on both coasts, difficulties moving goods back and forth, et cetera. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. Very correct. It's hard to see how long that will take, but it will resolve itself in time.
And that shows us also that the prices of shipping goods from China to the U.S. Has gone up, and I think that's gone up 400% from pre-pandemic. So that's going to, of course, add to the cost of anything we buy from China. So while we've got you two here, I guess what I'm wondering about are what are the solutions? Chair Powell, if we have issues with our ports or with the supply of semiconductors or other components, does it make much sense for the economy to pull back on investments in the bottlenecks, or would we do better to expand that capacity?
I think that's really a question for fiscal policy. I will say these are tangled supply chains right now, and it's a combination of a bunch of factors which should abate over time. But in terms of obviously investment in supply chains would make them more efficient over time.
Thank you. And so I want to point out here that most of the things we produce do require workers. And I spoke to you, Chair Powell, about this in February, but Secretary Yellen, you've, of course, studied labor markets throughout your career. So when we have constraints on our supply chain, does it make sense to limit the numbers of people able to work, or should we instead invest in policies like childcare that help get people into the workforce?
Well, absolutely. I think over the longer term, we've had a problem with declining labor force participation of prime age workers, and we're proposing paid leave, child care support, early childhood education supports that would help expand labor force participation. In the short run, of course, dealing with the pandemic to make sure schools can operate on a normal schedule, get people back to work will help as well.
And then there are other countries around the world that obviously have some of these pieces put in place, like, better child care, early childhood education. In your studies with them, do you see economic growth coming as a result of putting these practices in place?
Yes, it's been an important source of growth in the United States and elsewhere. Once upon a time, the United States, just with respect to women's labor force participation, had about the highest in the world, and that's changed radically in recent decades as we've failed to expand and provide the level of support for female, especially for women's labor force participation. We've fallen behind other developed countries.
Absolutely, and thank you. So what I'm hearing, it sounds like to me that Democrats, what we're proposing is actually a solution to some of these inflation concerns, and that doing nothing will actually exacerbate issues and make it worse. I'm, for one, not in the business of telling people what they can't buy. What I'm hoping that we can do is find solutions like childcare, like paid family leave, like lowering the cost of prescription drugs to keep money in people's pockets so that we can stop artificially limiting the capacity of America's economy and get people back to work to help create more products and move products around our country. So things like childcare, paid leave, and other policies will actually help expand the workforce. Thank you so much.
Gentlelady's time has expired. The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Rose, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Waters and Ranking Member McHenry, and I want to thank Chairman Powell and Secretary Yellen for being here today. I'm just going to dive right in. I do want to follow up on a couple of things that have been talked about quite a bit this morning. The debt limit, first of all. I feel like, there's a lot of misinformation that circulates about this. So to be clear, if we suspend the debt limit, that's to allow for the enlargement of the debt. Yes, some of that for programs that have been in place historically, but much of that for that would likely facilitate new spending. And I learned a long time ago from my dad not to sign blank checks. And so it seems to me that if we suspend the debt limit, that's kind of like signing a blank check. And frankly, I'm not willing to participate in signing that blank check. If we had assurances that that increase would go simply to cover the current built-in costs of operating the government, then that might be a different discussion, but that's not the one we're having. And then, Secretary Yellen, I want to follow up just for a second about the IRS reporting for bank account information, and I wonder in the administration's proposal, is there any allowance in that proposal to defray the costs that banks and financial institutions would incur from the added reporting expenses of providing this additional information to the IRS?
I don't believe it was in the administration's proposal, but if appropriate, we would be glad to work with Congress on that to defray any expense.
Well, I certainly know that the existing reporting requirements that banks face is to be short onerous and expensive, and of course, ultimately, their customers end up bearing that cost. I want to shift gears now. In May, the Treasury Department published an interim final rule to implement the Coronavirus State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund. Although the guidance was much needed, I continued to hear from cities and county mayors across my district, many of whom are here in town today, across my district, asking for additional clarification and flexibility. I wrote a letter to you in July requesting this additional flexibility in the final rule. Secretary Yellen, can you tell us when we can expect this updated guidance and if there will be increased flexibility included?
We've tried to provide a great deal of flexibility in the guidance we've provided. There is an interim final rule that's in place, and states and localities can rely on it. It was out for comment. We have received a very large number of comments that we're working through carefully, and we'll work to produce a final rule. But
any foreshadowing of when that rule might be available?
Later this year, but the interim final rule is quite permissive in terms of flexibility, and
we look forward to seeing that. Reclaiming my time, Secretary Yellen. Earlier this month, the committee reported the chairwoman's partisan bill that will have the effect of slowing down, in my opinion, the distribution of emergency rental assistance funds, punish landlords, and expose taxpayers to fraud. Part of her bill would replace having grantees determine if a household was, in fact, an eligible low-income household, as Congress intended with the self-attestation that requires grantees to accept any attestation of the household as true. Secretary Yellen, are you concerned that requiring grantees to accept all self-attestations of applicants who want to get free rental assistance money will increase the likelihood of fraud?
We're working carefully with Chairwoman Waters and want to make sure that we get money out in the most effective and rapid way possible while maintaining adequate controls to prevent fraud and abuse.
And Secretary Yellen, we've had several hearings regarding the emergency rental assistance program that is dispersed through Treasury, and yet you haven't appeared at a single one. And for that matter, you failed to appear at the Small Business Committee hearing as well. So I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to my good friend, Mr. Lukemeyer, the ranking member of the Small Business Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Secretary Yellen. I'm also the ranking member of the Small Business Committee, as Mr. Rose indicated. And last December, Congress passed a bipartisan bill that required you to testify in front of the Small Business Committee on the Paycheck Protection Program. That deadline has now passed 157 days ago, and you're still not there. You have willfully refused to come before the committee and willfully refused to obey the law. So my question is very simple. Why can you, a cabinet member of the Biden administration, pick and choose which laws you choose to follow? Please close your bender and please respond off the cuff. Why can you pick and choose which laws that you respond to?
I have testified 11 times before Congress during
but never in front of the Small Business Committee, Madam Chair.
7 months. I have agreed to do so. We have not been able to find an appropriate date that works.
Chair,
I have offered to have
I can show you a list of your
time has expired.
You've been able to come in contact with.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, who is also the chair of the task force on financial technology, is now recognized for 5 minutes. Excuse me, Mr. Lynch, please turn your microphone on.
I apologize to Ms. Adams. First of all, as someone for the past 20 years has worked with both Republican and Democratic administrations to allow our government to meet our obligations to our senior citizens and Social Security, pay our troops, and pay our bills, I view this latest threat to default on our debt as a direct attack on the American people and on our government itself. Never has it been a good time to destroy the full faith and credit of the United States. And I fully support Mr. Foster's bill, House 3305, which would change the whole dynamic of raising the debt limit. I would like to ask you about the rollout of the CARES Act. And Madam Secretary, I know that was a joint program between Treasury and the SBA. As Chairwoman Waters pointed out, I chair the task force on fintech. And while there were very little connections between most of the fintech firms and the SBA prior to the pandemic, once we gave them about $330 billion in the second phase of the PPP program, the fintechs engaged. They were able to put out, I think, 15% of the funding through fintech lenders to people who needed it. Unfortunately, however, about 75% of the fraud that we detected was from that 15% that went out through fintech lenders. And these were even some of our best. Cabbage, which previously had never handled an SBA loan. They were one of the companies that had difficulties. I'm just wondering if there were any lessons learned about that rollout. I know we were rushed. We were pushing to get, especially the first phase, the banks took care of their favorite customers. I understand that. And those were known entities. And then we in Congress encouraged a further reach out for the SBA for people who were not met and were not addressed in the initial phase. But are there any, we had the rushed aspect of it. There was also, I'm not sure what the API interface is between the SBA and these fintech lenders. I know the relationships are new, but did we learn any lessons from that interaction in getting money out to people who need it through the fintech companies and lenders that we used?
Well, certainly there are oversight and review processes that are taking place. I can get back to you. I don't have details on what we've found about fintech lenders, and I guess the SBA is probably doing much of that review of the Paycheck Protection Program. But in every aspect of developing programs that have been assigned to Treasury, we've worked right from the outset with our offices of Inspector General and others to make sure that we have appropriate reporting and fraud control in place to minimize fraud in the programs and make sure that we have controls in place.
Okay. Chairman Powell, any thoughts on that, or would you rather take a pass?
I'll follow up and also see if we have anything on that for you. Of course, the PPP was administered by the SBA. We did the liquidity facility.
Okay.
I'd be happy to, in that part of it, be happy to check and come back to you.
That would be great. And Madam Secretary, would you again talk about what happens upon default and what that means for the American people?
It's a catastrophe. We're likely to end up with a financial crisis, surely a recession, and millions of individuals who are counting on checks from the government not receiving those in a timely fashion, and long-lasting consequences of higher interest rates for everybody who borrows.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. The gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Chairman Powell, Secretary Yellen, thank you for being with us here today. Out of the gates, Secretary Yellen, I'd just like to note that the proposal for bank account reporting that you do not believe to be an invasion of privacy, I'd just like to be on the record that I believe that this would be an invasion of privacy, and I remain concerned with it. I'd like to jump over to debt to GDP. In a previous question, you noted that crossing the threshold of 100% of debt to GDP in the United States, now roughly 105%, was not fiscally irresponsible. Is that correct? In a comment to Mr. Torres, he was examining.
Yes. I believe we're in a place where we can certainly bear the burden of the debt now and in the future.
And you believe that because we're currently in a low inflationary environment with low interest rates. Is that accurate?
That's right, but I'm assuming that interest rates, as the economy recovers, will move up to a more normal level in line with the forecasts of many professional forecasters.
And if in the event that the inflationary rate increased beyond that current forecast by the experts that you're speaking with, that would increase the burden on the debt, would that then become fiscally irresponsible to have a debt to GDP ratio over 100%?
Well, it depends what happens to real interest rates in the economy. If they were to rise significantly, that, of course, poses a risk that we need to take into account.
I think we should absolutely take it into account. I'm very concerned with the spending proposals from the Biden administration and the impact that would have in the event that we enter a more inflationary period where interest rates increase.
I want to make clear that the proposals from the Biden administration are neutral with respect to the debt path, that the projections that we have shown display essentially a level debt path over the next 10 years, and beyond 15 years, substantially reduce the outstanding debt to GDP ratio.
I remain very concerned about the debt path that the Biden administration is taking us on, and a whole array of spending proposals that we're seeing. Let me shift gears slightly over to you, Mr. Chairman Powell, if I can, and build on this topic as it relates to inflation. It's something I've spoken with you many times about, in particular in this committee in July, December of last year. And in those times you've suggested, and I think you've continued to state, the Fed's not ready to take action to head off inflation, yet we're continuing to see prices to increase. We saw consumer prices increase 5.4% year over year more recently, and continuing, and regardless of what the White House press team says, I think people are really seeing the impact of higher prices day in and day out. Now, I know that you've said many of these you believe to be transitory, that you think they'll come down, but here's my concern, is that individual and the public expectations are beginning to change as people truly see the price increases when they go to fill up their car with gas.